Ever since I moved into the old house on Oakwood Street, I've been experiencing moments that defy logical explanation. At first, it was little things. The soft creak of floorboards when I thought I was alone. The way my keys sometimes vanish from the bowl on the entry table only to reappear later in the fridge or even tucked inside a book. I chalked it up to absent-mindedness or the quirks of an aging building. The peculiar occurrences were so minor that I dismissed them as coincidences, mere side effects of fatigue from long workdays and restless nights. But as the weeks passed, the anomalies began to accumulate in a way that I could no longer ignore. It started with objects shifting positions, even though I was certain I'd left them exactly where they belonged. One evening, after returning from a routine walk around the neighborhood, I discovered that my favorite mug had been replaced by an identical one bearing tiny scratches I didn't remember. At first, I convinced myself that it was simply a misremembered detail or a trick of the light. However, the frequency of these incidents steadily increased, until every day seemed punctuated by subtle but unsettling disruptions. A framed photo would be slightly askew one morning and perfectly aligned the next. A book I distinctly recalled placing on my desk was found later on the kitchen counter. I began to wonder if I was simply losing track of my own actions. Then, more disconcerting encounters crept into my daily routine. While grocery shopping or strolling through the nearby park, I would catch glimpses of faces that struck me with an eerie sense of familiarity. On one occasion, a kindly older man in a worn jacket greeted me by name outside a small market, insisting we'd been friends for years. When I tried to engage him further, he only offered a warm smile and disappeared into the crowd as if swallowed by the city itself. I asked around afterward, but no one knew of such a man, and no record of our acquaintance existed. These moments, though brief, left a lingering impression, a feeling that perhaps I was witnessing fragments of another life or echoes from a past I couldn't recall. Late at night, the disturbances grew even more perplexing. In the silence of my room, I began hearing soft whispers that seemed to originate from nowhere. At first, I assumed these were merely the winds rattling old window panes, but the voices formed coherent words on occasion, murmurs of reassurance, or sometimes faint pleas that sounded almost desperate. One particular night, as I lay in bed, I distinctly heard a lullaby drifting through the air, a tune my mother used to sing, though she had been gone for years. I forced myself to dismiss it as a trick of my imagination, a byproduct of loneliness and exhaustion, yet a seed of doubt had been planted deep inside me. Desperate for an explanation, I started keeping a meticulous journal, recording every instance of the inexplicable, the shifting objects, the unaccounted for voices, and even the inexplicable sensation of being watched. I installed a few cameras in the common areas of the house and set up a digital recorder in my bedroom. When I reviewed the footage, there were moments when a shadow flitted across the frame or a door slowly creaked open on its own, but these clips were too brief and grainy to provide any real answers. Every time I attempted to rationalize the events, my logical mind would find a mundane explanation, a faulty sensor, a draft in the hall, but the mounting evidence seemed to defy any conventional reasoning. As days turned into weeks, the anomalies began to overlap and intensify. Sometimes, I would come home to find items I distinctly remembered putting away now inexplicably scattered about the house. Other times, I'd catch a glimpse of a figure in the periphery of my vision, a person dressed in outdated clothing whose eyes seemed to plead silently before vanishing in an instant. I started to question whether these were tricks of a tired mind or something far more disturbing. Friends, when I confided in them, offered gentle reassurances that stress and isolation could conjure such illusions. Yet, deep down, I couldn't shake the growing dread that something was very, very wrong. I even began to notice sounds that resonated with inexplicable familiarity. The soft creaking of the wooden floors sometimes echoed a rhythm that reminded me of footsteps from decades past. In the stillness of the night, I could swear that distant laughter and murmured conversations filled the silence. Voices that seemed to belong to another era, another life. I scoured local records and spoke with a few longtime residents, only to be met with vague recollections of the house's murky past, hints of tragedies and unexplained disappearances that had been swept under the rug. Their reluctance to speak further fueled my suspicions, leaving me wondering if I had unwittingly become a part of a larger, inexplicable narrative. Now, as I sit in the dim light of my living room, every shadow and creak seems loaded with significance. I've accumulated photographs, audio recordings, and journal entries, yet nothing conclusively proves whether these events are real or just figments of an overactive imagination. The more I document, the more the line between reality and delusion blurs. I find myself questioning if I'm the unwitting host to a paranormal presence, or merely succumbing to the isolation and stress of living alone in a house with a history too murky to understand. Was I simply tired, or am I now caught in the grip of something inexplicable, a series of coincidences that have morphed into a living nightmare? Every unanswered question leads to more doubts. Is there someone else here with me, slipping in and out of sight, or is it all a construct of my mind desperately trying to make sense of the unsolvable? I'm left with the unsettling possibility that these experiences might be real, hinting at a reality that lies just beyond the veil of the ordinary. Or perhaps they are nothing more than the elaborate dreams of a fractured mind. And so, I continue to observe, record, and question, trapped in a cycle where every discovery only deepens the mystery, leaving me to wonder whether I will ever find a rational explanation, or if the truth, whatever it may be, is destined to remain forever just out of reach. I first noticed him on an overcast afternoon at a local cafe. I was seated near the window with a book and a half-forgotten cup of tea when I saw him. He sat at a table across the room, casually reading a newspaper. His eyes briefly met mine, and I felt a subtle chill, as if his gaze carried an unspoken intensity. I shrugged it off as nothing more than an awkward coincidence, a random moment shared by two strangers in a crowded place. That day, I left the cafe with a mild sense of unease but no real reason to be alarmed. Over the next few days, I began to see him again in different settings. One morning, while waiting for the bus near my apartment, I noticed him standing on the opposite corner, watching the arriving vehicles with an inscrutable expression. I couldn't tell if he was simply waiting for his ride, or if he was there solely to observe me. I told myself it was just chance, that I was letting my imagination run wild. Yet, the memory of that gaze lingered long after the bus had departed. A week later, on a cool evening stroll through the park, I caught a glimpse of him again. He was sitting on a bench beneath a flickering street lamp, his posture relaxed, yet his eyes fixed on the path where I was walking. At first, I considered the possibility that he was an ordinary park-goer, but then he stood up and began walking in my direction. I quickened my pace, my heart thumping in my chest. When our eyes met briefly as he passed by, his smile was polite, almost too friendly, and I couldn't shake the disquiet that surged within me. Was he merely coincidental, or was there something more deliberate about his presence? In the following days, his appearances became increasingly frequent and varied. At a grocery store near my work, I found him lingering in the produce aisle, glancing in my direction every so often. At first, I tried to ignore it, blaming it on the crowded nature of the store. But then, in the late hours after closing time at a quiet bookstore, I encountered him again. This time, he struck up a casual conversation about a book I had been considering. His tone conversational, yet his eyes holding a curious intensity that left me feeling exposed. I managed a few polite words before excusing myself, the conversation echoing in my mind with a disconcerting aftertaste. The situation escalated one chilly evening when I received a text from an unknown number, a single message that read, "I see you." I stared at the screen, a cold wave of fear washing over me. I tried to trace the number, but it led nowhere. That message, so simple yet so invasive, forced me to confront a growing anxiety that I was being watched, that my daily routine was no longer private. I began to notice small signs that something was amiss at home too. Objects in my apartment were slightly moved from where I had left them. A book on the coffee table placed on the kitchen counter, a set of keys found on the floor rather than on the hook by the door. Each time, I scolded myself for being forgetful, but a persistent, nagging doubt whispered that these were not mere accidents. Late one night, unable to sleep amid the constant hum of my racing thoughts, I ventured out for a walk in a bid to clear my head. The streets were nearly empty under the dim glow of streetlights when I saw him again, standing beneath a flickering lamppost. His silhouette was unmistakable, and he seemed to be waiting for me, as if anticipating my every move. My pulse raced, and despite a part of me yearning for a rational explanation, I felt an overwhelming urge to retreat into the safety of my home. I hurried back, every step weighed down by the unsettling realization that his presence was no longer confined to mere coincidence. At work, I began to feel the effects of constant vigilance. Every time I glanced out the window or past a reflective surface, I half expected to catch sight of him. My colleagues noticed my distracted demeanor, though when I mentioned my encounters, they offered only polite reassurances, suggesting that perhaps stress or fatigue was playing tricks on my mind. But the evidence I had accumulated, his unmistakable face in multiple places, the unexplained text message, the subtle disturbances in my home, made it impossible to dismiss my growing fear as a mere figment of an overactive imagination. Now, as I sit in my apartment late at night, the walls echo with the sound of my own racing thoughts. Every creak in the floor, every shadow that drifts across the window, sends my mind spiraling back to his unblinking eyes and that unsettling smile. I have tried to piece together the pattern of his appearances, each encounter, each fleeting moment of recognition. But the more I search for logic, the more I feel ensnared in a plan that I never agreed to be part of. It's as if every aspect of my daily life has been subtly orchestrated to remind me that I am not alone, that someone is always watching, always waiting. I find myself questioning every detail. Is it all just a series of bizarre coincidences, or am I truly the target of someone's obsessive surveillance? I can't help but wonder if this stranger is simply an eccentric soul whose path happens to cross mine repeatedly, or if his calculated appearances are part of something far more sinister. Even now, as I write these words with trembling hands, I remain trapped in an inescapable cycle of fear and uncertainty. Every day, I brace myself for another unexpected encounter, another unnerving moment that blurs the line between chance and deliberate intent. And so, I am left with a haunting question. Are these unsettling coincidences just that, a cruel twist of fate? Or is someone truly stalking me, turning my life into a stage for their own twisted performance? I've never been the type to get spooked easily. I pride myself on being rational, someone who looks for explanations before jumping to conclusions. But what happened to me a few years ago still keeps me up at night, because no matter how I try to explain it, I can't shake the feeling that something truly sinister was at play. It started with the apartment I rented for a temporary work assignment in a small town. The place was nothing special. One bedroom, creaky floors, and outdated kitchen. But it was cheap, and the landlord seemed nice enough. He was an older man, maybe in his 60s, with a tired face and a slow way of speaking. When I signed the lease, he handed me the keys and said something odd. "Just make sure you lock the door at night." He chuckled afterward like he was joking, but something in his tone lingered. I moved in on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Everything seemed perfectly normal at first. The neighbors were polite but distant, the kind of people who would nod in passing but never stop for a chat. The only person who ever engaged with me was the woman next door, Mrs. Calloway. She was in her 50s, well-dressed, with an air of quiet urgency about her. The day after I moved in, she knocked on my door with a plate of cookies, an act of kindness that felt out of place in an otherwise indifferent building. "You're new here," she said, glancing over my shoulder into my apartment. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to knock." I thanked her, but something about her expression made me uneasy. It wasn't friendliness, it was more like concern. That first week, small things started happening that I brushed off as quirks of an old building. Doors creaked open on their own, the plumbing groaned in the middle of the night, and sometimes I'd hear what sounded like soft shuffling in the hallway when I knew no one was there. Normal stuff, really. I told myself it was just my imagination adjusting to a new space. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of scratching. It was faint, coming from the front door. I lay still listening, my heart pounding. It wasn't the wind or a branch tapping against a window. It was deliberate, slow, persistent. I got up, crept to the door, and looked through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty. The next morning, I ran into Mrs. Calloway as I was leaving for work. She gave me a once-over, her eyes lingering on the dark circles under mine. "You should get more rest," she said, almost like a warning. That was when I noticed it. Her door had 3 heavy-duty locks on it. Not just the standard deadbolt, but thick industrial-grade locks. The kind you'd see in a panic room. That night, I made sure to bolt my door, though I still wasn't convinced there was anything to worry about. But the next strange event shook me. I was in the kitchen washing dishes when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, but something made me turn toward the window. Outside, on the fire escape, a man was standing perfectly still. He wasn't looking directly at me, but just past me, like he could see through me. His face was expressionless, and his hands hung limply at his sides. My breath caught in my throat. My first instinct was to grab my phone, but the moment I moved, he stepped back into the shadows and was gone. I rushed to the window, heart hammering. The fire escape didn't even have a ladder leading down. It was 3 floors up with no easy way to access it from the ground. That was the first time I truly felt fear in that apartment. The next day, I went straight to the landlord. I told him about the man on the fire escape, expecting concern or at least surprise. Instead, he let out a heavy sigh, rubbing his temples like he'd been through this before. "Did he do anything?" he asked. "No," I said. "But shouldn't we call the police?" His lips pressed into a thin line. "I can install another lock." That was it. No explanación. No reassurance. Just another lock like that was supposed to solve the problem. That evening, Mrs. Calloway knocked again. This time, she wasn't carrying cookies. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation and closed the door behind her. "You need to leave," she said in a hushed voice. "Tonight." He stared here, confused. "What are you talking about?" She wrung her hands, looking toward the window as if she expected someone to be listening. "It's not safe here. Mrs. Calloway, you're scaring me." "You should be scared," she whispered. "Whatever you do, don't answer the door after midnight." That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing noises, soft tapping, the occasional creak of the floorboards outside my apartment. At exactly midnight, I heard the knocking. It was slow, measured, like whoever was on the other side knew I was awake and was waiting. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The knocking stopped after what felt like forever. Then came the whisper, "Let me in." A cold dread spread through me. The voice was low and unnatural, like it didn't belong to any person I knew. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to go away. When I finally opened them, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The doorknob was turning. Slowly, deliberately, and then silence. I stayed up until dawn, gripping my phone with shaking hands. The next morning, I went straight to my landlord and told him I was breaking the lease. I didn't care about the deposit. I didn't care if I had nowhere else to go. I just needed to leave. He didn't argue. He just nodded, like he expected it. As I was hauling my last suitcase out, I ran into Mrs. Calloway one last time. She gave me a knowing look, but didn't say anything. I wanted to ask her what she knew, why she had all those locks, why she had warned me, but I was too afraid of the answer. I never looked back. Months later, curiosity got the better of me, and I searched online for anything about that building. I found an old forum post buried deep in a thread about urban legends. It mentioned strange occurrences, people leaving in the middle of the night, doors unlocking on their own. And then one comment stood out. "No one knows who he is, but he's always watching. And if you let him in, you don't leave." I don't know who or what I encountered in that apartment, but I know one thing. I was never supposed to stay. I never imagined that one seemingly ordinary encounter could unravel my sense of safety so completely. It started innocuously enough when I was waiting at the bus stop one drizzly evening after a long day at work. I noticed a man standing a few feet away, his posture relaxed, his eyes following the rhythm of the raindrops. He offered a polite nod and a soft, friendly good evening. that struck me as genuine enough. I returned the greeting, dismissing the encounter as nothing more than a brief moment of neighborly politeness. But that was only the beginning. Over the next several weeks, I began noticing him in places I never expected. At first, it was just a quick glance, a friendly smile across the grocery store aisle, or a brief hello in the corridor of my apartment building. Each time, his presence was unremarkable, even comforting in its consistency. I even started to look forward to our fleeting interactions, believing that a kind soul might be my only connection in an increasingly isolating city. Yet, a few subtle details began to nag at me. During one conversation at a local park, he casually mentioned that he'd seen me leave a cafe on Maple Street just an hour before. I was startled. Maple Street wasn't on any of my usual routes, and I'd never been there in months. I laughed it off, blaming a memory lapse on my part, but the seed of unease was planted. As the days turned into weeks, his appearances became less sporadic and more calculated. I started receiving comments that were too specific, too intimately timed. One morning, while I was waiting for the subway, he approached me with an oddly warm smile and said, "I saw you were having a rough day yesterday after that meeting. I know how much that meant to you." I froze, my heart pounding, because I hadn't mentioned any of that to anyone, not even a friend. I tried to steer the conversation to safer topics, but he persisted, his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. His tone was gentle, his words soft, yet every syllable carried an undercurrent of something far more intrusive than simple concern. I began to notice other disconcerting details too. At work, during a brief encounter in the parking lot, he mentioned something personal about my family, a comment about my sister's birthday celebration that I had explicitly kept private. His words were delivered in the most casual manner possible, as if discussing the weather, yet the fact that he knew these things made my blood run cold. I started to wonder how he was obtaining such information. Did he follow me? Was someone feeding him details about my life? I felt like a character in a nightmare, caught in a web of observations I couldn't explain. Late one night, as I sat alone in my apartment trying to distract myself with mindless television, a notification pinged on my phone, a message from an unknown number. It read simply, "I know where you are." I stared at it, my pulse quickening, a mix of panic and disbelief overwhelming me. I tried to trace the number, but it led nowhere. That message, so curt and menacing, shattered whatever semblance of normalcy I still clung to. The following days were filled with a relentless paranoia. Every shadow in my apartment seemed to shift. Every creak in the hallway echoed like a whisper of his presence. I attempted to maintain my routines, going to work, meeting friends, even trying to enjoy a quiet dinner in my favorite bistro. But every public place became a stage where I anticipated his arrival. At one point, while sitting alone at a quiet corner table in that very bistro, I caught him watching me through the window. His eyes were fixed, unblinking, as if he were cataloging every detail of my appearance and behavior. I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way I'd never experienced before. The more I tried to rationalize his actions as mere coincidences, the more I realized that nothing about this could be random. My attempts to find a logical explanation only deepened my fear. I spoke with a coworker about the encounters, and while he offered sympathetic nods, he insisted that maybe I was reading too much into harmless interactions. But the evidence I had, those unervingly precise comments about my day, the personal details he mentioned, the cryptic text message, was too compelling to ignore. I began documenting every encounter in a journal, noting times, locations, and every detail of our interactions. The entries painted a picture of someone who seemed to be meticulously tracking my movements, anticipating my moods, and inserting himself into the smallest corners of my life. In my mind, I started constructing scenarios. Perhaps he was an obsessive fan, or worse, someone with the technical means to monitor my every move. Every time I left my apartment, I double-checked the locks, scanned the street for any sign of him, and altered my routine in hopes of breaking the pattern. But no matter what I did, the unsettling sense of being watched persisted. I began to lose sleep, haunted by the notion that this stranger, who had once seemed so benign, was slowly morphing into an intruder in my life, a shadow that lurked in every unexpected moment. Now, as I write this in the dim light of my living room, my hands tremble slightly with a mixture of exhaustion and dread. I review the journal entries and text messages, trying to piece together a logical narrative that could explain his behavior. Yet every explanation I conjure only leads to more questions. Is it possible that I'm simply overreacting? That my mind has constructed a monster out of harmless coincidences? Or is this a calculated intrusion? A subtle, invasive presence that has infiltrated my life with malicious intent? I'm left in a state of perpetual uncertainty, questioning every smile, every kind word, every casual remark that now feels like a coded message meant only for me. And so I wonder, as the rain taps against my window and my thoughts spiral into darkness, are these encounters nothing more than bizarre coincidences? Or is there truly someone out there, methodically tracking my every move, turning my life into a carefully orchestrated stage for their own twisted performance? It began on what should have been an ordinary night. I had just returned home from a long day at work, exhausted and eager for the comfort of my quiet apartment in a nondescript suburb. The evening was calm, and as I unlocked my front door, I felt nothing but relief at the prospect of a hot shower and a peaceful night. But that calm was shattered almost immediately by an unnerving sensation, as if I were not alone. At first, I dismissed it as mere fatigue, a trick of my mind. However, as I stepped inside, I noticed a slight chill in the air, a subtle disturbance that hinted at a presence I couldn't quite explain. I went about my evening routine, trying to reestablish a sense of normalcy. I set a kettle on the stove and settled in with a book on the couch. Yet, the feeling of being watched clung to me like a shadow. I kept glancing toward the window, half expecting to see someone lingering outside in the dark. Just as I began to convince myself that it was all in my head, a soft knock at the door startled me. I crept to the peephole and peered out to see a man standing there. He wore a dark coat and a brimmed hat that cast his face in obscurity. With a gentle smile and a calm good evening, he introduced himself as Daniel, a new neighbor who had just moved in across the hall. His manner was friendly enough, and for a moment, I felt relieved that his visit was nothing more than neighborly courtesy. Over the following days, I encountered Daniel more frequently. At first, his presence was innocuous. A warm greeting in the hallway, a brief chat in the laundry room, a shared laugh in the building's courtyard. But soon, little details began to unsettle me. In one conversation in the lobby, he casually remarked, "I saw you grab your mail from the box just before I passed by," even though I distinctly remembered checking it later that day. On another occasion, while I was walking to work, he mentioned that he'd noticed my umbrella left behind at a cafe, despite the fact I had replaced it just the day before. It was as if he knew every small detail of my routine, details I'd never shared with him. Then, one night, as I was reading in bed, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps pacing slowly in the hallway outside my door. The rhythmic tapping grew louder, then halted abruptly. I sat frozen, listening as the silence deepened, only to be broken by a faint knock that sent my heart racing. I fumbled for my phone and tried to call a friend, but the line only offered cold, empty static. When I finally mustered the courage to check the peephole, the hallway was empty. Yet, the oppressive feeling that someone had been there, someone watching, remained with me long after I had locked my door. The next morning brought an even more disturbing discovery. I awoke to find my front door slightly ajar, though I was certain I had bolted it before bed. Inside, signs of a quiet intrusion were everywhere. A cushion askew on the sofa, a picture frame lying on its side, and faint, inexplicable fingerprints on the glass of a cabinet door. I spent the entire day in a state of hypervigilance, repeatedly checking every lock and window. I questioned my own memory, wondering if exhaustion had played tricks on me. Yet deep down, I knew I had not left the door open. Desperate for answers, I began meticulously documenting every encounter. I noted the times I saw Daniel, the strange comments he made, and the odd incidents around my apartment. I even installed a small security camera by the front door, hoping that recorded evidence might shed light on the mystery. Yet the footage revealed only empty hallways and silent corridors. No trace of Daniel's presence. No hint that anyone had been near my door. Still, the memory of his disarming smile and the weight of his knowing gaze haunted me relentlessly. Unable to endure the mounting anxiety, I finally confronted him one evening in the hallway. My voice trembled as I asked, "Daniel, how do you always seem to know where I am? How is it that you notice things about me that no one else would?" He only smiled, his expression unreadable behind the shadow of his hat, and replied with a nonchalant, "I just pay attention." His words did nothing to allay my fear. In fact, they deepened it. There was an unsettling certainty in his tone, as if he were confessing to a secret I was never meant to know. In the weeks that followed, my once safe home transformed into a place of constant dread. I began to see fleeting reflections of Daniel in mirrors and windows, hear his soft, almost imperceptible laughter in the silence of night, and even receive anonymous notes slipped under my door that simply read, "I see you." Every day, I lived in terror that the walls of my apartment were no longer my sanctuary, that every creak and shadow was a reminder of an unseen observer. I tried explaining the events to friends and even to myself, but no rational explanation could account for the precise and invasive pattern of occurrences. Even now, as I sit alone in the dim light of my living room, my hands still tremble with the memory of that night. Every gust of wind against the window, every subtle sound in the hallway, is a reminder that I may never be alone again. I have searched for a logical reason. Perhaps I was the victim of a clever prank, or maybe my mind was unraveling under stress, but nothing fits. I know with absolute certainty that what I experienced was real and terrifying. I share this story on our /True Scary Stories because I want others to know that sometimes the most inexplicable horrors can happen to anyone, leaving you with no answers. Only the lingering dread that someone, somewhere is watching. It all began on an ordinary Thursday. I was on my way to work, coffee in hand, when I noticed a man standing across the street. He was dressed in a dark coat and wore a hat pulled low over his eyes. At first, I thought nothing of it, just another commuter waiting for the light to change. But as I passed, he raised a hand in greeting. I paused for a moment, confused. He wasn't someone I recognized, but then the light turned green, and he melted into the crowd. I dismissed it as a random encounter, nothing more. That same day at the office, small anomalies started to pile up. During a routine meeting, I glanced at my watch and realized I had lost nearly 15 minutes without any sense of time passing. The meeting's discussion seemed to loop back on itself, as if we were rehashing points we had just made. I found it odd, but attributed it to a sleepy haze after a rough night's sleep. Over the next few days, I began encountering the same man in unexpected places. One morning, on my way out of the subway station, I saw him leaning casually against a pillar, staring blankly ahead. Another time, I caught a glimpse of his reflection in a shop window as I passed by, except his face was different. In one moment, his eyes were a piercing blue. The next, they were a muted gray. His expression shifted too, from friendly to somber, almost melancholic. I started to wonder if I was misremembering him, if perhaps there were two men who looked identical. But the memory was too precise. It was always the same person, yet his appearance kept glitching like a corrupted video file. The strange occurrences weren't confined to strangers alone. At home, my surroundings began to betray me in subtle ways. I would leave a book on the coffee table and later find it on the kitchen counter, as if someone had rearranged my possessions while I wasn't looking. One evening, I stepped into my living room only to see the sofa slightly rotated, a detail so minor that I questioned my own attention to it. However, these minor shifts became more frequent. I started to lose chunks of time. I'd go to bed and wake up with no memory of what had happened in between. On one occasion, I even discovered a note on my bedside table, written in a neat, unfamiliar script. "Time is not what you think." The words sent a shiver down my spine, but when I mentioned it to a friend later, they laughed it off as a prank. Then came the moments that truly unsettled me. One afternoon, I decided to take a detour on my way home, a shortcut through a narrow alley I'd never noticed before. As I walked, the streetlights overhead flickered erratically, and the sound of my footsteps seemed to echo far longer than usual. When I emerged on the other side, I found myself on a street that looked nearly identical to the one I had just left, yet there were subtle differences. The storefronts were arranged in a different order, and a familiar mural on a building had been replaced by an image I didn't recognize. I retraced my steps, but the alley was gone, as if it had never existed. I began to question whether I was losing my grip on reality. My personal life started to feel like a series of glitches in an old film. Conversations with friends would loop back on themselves. I'd recall discussing a topic in detail, only for them to insist that we had never talked about it. My recollection of events was at odds with everyone else's memory, and I began to feel isolated in a reality that seemed to change whenever I wasn't looking. I took to recording my days on my phone, hoping that the camera's unerring record might anchor me to something real. Yet when I reviewed the footage, there were moments where the scene would repeat itself, a loop of actions I was sure I had already witnessed. Faces in the background would flicker, changing expression mid-frame, as if an unseen editor was cutting between different versions of the same moment. One evening, after a particularly unsettling day at work where I lost nearly an hour in what felt like a blink, I sat alone in my apartment trying to piece together the anomalies. I flipped through my journal and noticed a pattern emerging. Every glitch, every shift in time or space, seemed to follow that inexplicable encounter with the man in the dark coat. The more I thought about it, the more I began to suspect that his appearances were somehow triggering these changes. It wasn't just that he kept showing up, it was that each time, reality itself seemed to warp around his presence. I started to wonder if I had somehow become a variable in a much larger, incomprehensible experiment. Now, as I sit in my dimly lit apartment late at night, I can't help but feel that the world I once knew is unraveling. The boundaries between what is real and what is altered have blurred. I no longer trust my own senses. Every knock at the door, every flicker of the streetlights outside, fills me with a sense of impending change. I've begun to accept that these glitches might be permanent, a new layer of reality overlaying the one I once thought was immutable. My memories feel patchy, like a film reel missing frames, and I fear that I've become trapped in a loop, an anomaly within a broken matrix. The more I try to cling to normalcy, the more I realize that normalcy is just an illusion. That random encounter, the man with the shifting features, was the spark that ignited this cascade of inexplicable events. I'm left with the haunting thought that maybe I'm not just witnessing these glitches, but that I have become one with them. The reality I once knew might have been nothing more than a carefully constructed facade, now crumbling into a series of endless, repeating fragments. And as I face each day with a mix of resignation and dread, I wonder if I will ever truly break free from this fractured loop, or if I'm destined to live forever in the spaces between what was and what is, forever a glitch in the matrix. I moved into the apartment on a quiet fall day, the kind that promised new beginnings and a clean slate. The unit was small and unassuming, a modest space with creaking hardwood floors, a sunlit living room, and a view of an inner courtyard. For the first few weeks, life felt predictable. I unpacked my belongings, arranged my furniture with care, and established a routine that was comforting in its familiarity. But it all began to change in ways I couldn't quite explain. One evening, after a long day at work, I returned home to find the living room exactly as I had left it, a vase of fresh daisies on the coffee table, my favorite armchair angled just so, and a framed photo of my family hanging on the wall. Yet, as I passed by the table, I noticed something odd. The vase, which I had placed near the window, was now pushed slightly toward the center of the room. I paused, frowning in confusion. Had I moved it in my exhaustion? I told myself no. I was certain I had not. I shrugged it off as a minor lapse in memory and went to bed. The next morning, a small envelope lay on my doormat. Inside, a handwritten note read simply, "You are not alone." I asked the neighbors about it, but everyone insisted they had never seen anything unusual. I began to wonder if I was simply imagining the whole thing. But as the days passed, the changes became more persistent. One day, I left my keys on a small hook by the door, and later, when I returned from a quick errand, I found them resting on the kitchen counter instead. I retraced my steps in my mind, convinced I hadn't touched them, yet there they were. At work, things began to feel strange, too. My routine meetings felt oddly repetitive, and I began noticing the same faces in the same spots over and over again, even in different contexts. A colleague who usually sat in the far corner of the break room was, on one occasion, inexplicably in the middle of the room. The entire office, which I had always taken for granted as predictable, now seemed to be rearranging itself when I wasn't paying close attention. Returning home one evening, I discovered even more unsettling alterations. The picture frame above the sofa, which I had hung just days before, was now tilted at an angle that wasn't there before. The books on my shelf had been reordered in a pattern I didn't recognize, and a new, unfamiliar poster hung on the wall in the hallway. My heart pounded as I attempted to recall every detail of how I had arranged things, but the memory was fading, replaced by a nagging sense of dislocation. I started documenting everything, taking photographs at different times of the day, jotting down every minute change in a worn leather journal. I hoped that by comparing the images, I could find some rational explanation. The differences were always subtle. A cushion slightly out of place, a door left ajar that I was sure I had closed, or a note scribbled on a napkin that read, "Time repeats." Yet, no matter how closely I examined these inconsistencies, they defied logic. I wasn't doing it. I was not the one rearranging my life piece by piece. Then one night, I awoke in a cold sweat. I'd had a dream so vivid it blurred the line between sleep and wakefulness. In the dream, I walked through my apartment and found every object exactly as it should be, only to realize that something fundamental was missing, a sense of continuity, a thread that tied yesterday to today. I awoke to the sound of a faint creak coming from the hallway. Gathering my courage, I crept out of bed and peered through the living room. Everything looked normal at first glance. But then I noticed the door to my bedroom was slightly ajar, a door I was absolutely sure I had closed before sleeping. I stepped forward and saw, on the wall near the door, a smear of ink in a pattern I didn't recognize, a symbol, perhaps, or a fragment of a message. My pulse quickened as I reached out to touch it, only to recoil when I realized I could not recall ever putting it there. I began to suspect that these small glitches were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger, inexplicable system. Every time I thought I'd settled into a familiar routine, reality would subtly shift, as though it were being rewritten before my eyes. The repetition was maddening. The same corridor, the same objects, the same disjointed hints of messages I couldn't decipher. I felt as if I were caught in a loop, trapped in a version of my life that was constantly being edited without my consent. One evening, after returning from a late shift, I sat alone in the darkened living room, the only light coming from a street lamp outside the window. I stared at the coffee table, where that vase of daisies once stood in its precise spot, and a thought began to crystallize in my mind. What if the apartment itself was no longer the stable haven I believed it to be? What if I had unwittingly stepped into an alternate version of reality? One where the rules of normalcy no longer applied, and every return to the same place revealed a new, disturbing variation. As the thought sank in, I felt a deep, bone-chilling dread. I looked around at the familiar surroundings that now felt alien. A place where every object could change. Every note left behind might be a cryptic message from an unseen force. The line between what was real and what was altered was blurring until it became nearly impossible to tell the difference. I realized then that I wasn't merely observing these changes from the outside. I was a part of them. I was trapped in a closed loop, an ever-shifting labyrinth of moments that repeated and transformed before my eyes. Now, as I write this in a trembling hand and a foggy mind, I have come to accept a terrifying truth. The reality I once knew has dissolved into something mutable, something engineered by forces beyond my understanding. Each day I wake, hoping for the normalcy of yesterday, only to find that my world has changed in ways I cannot predict. I no longer know if I am in control of my life, or if I am simply a character in a story that rewrites itself every time I blink. And as I face this endless loop of subtle, yet insidious alterations, I am left to wonder whether escaping this cycle is even possible, or if perhaps I was meant to become part of this glitch forever, lost in a reality that is no longer my own. It began on an ordinary Tuesday evening. I'd come home from a long day at work and, as usual, placed my keys in the bowl by the door. That night, as I made dinner in my small apartment, I reached for the fork I always used and found it missing. I searched the kitchen, on the counter, in the dishwasher, even in the sink, but it had vanished without a trace. I chalked it up to distraction, or perhaps a clumsy moment in the haze of exhaustion. After all, small things go missing sometimes, right? Over the next few days, more items started disappearing. A favorite pen from my desk, a book I had just finished reading, even the mug I used every morning. At first, I assumed I was simply misplacing them. But then, I began to notice subtle changes in my apartment. One evening, I walked into the living room and saw that the couch, which I had left neatly arranged against the wall, was now angled slightly toward the window. I remembered positioning it myself, and yet couldn't recall ever moving it. I dismissed it as my memory failing me and tried to ignore the gnawing unease. Then came the marks. One morning, I discovered a series of thin, red scratches on the baseboard in the hallway. Scratches that looked too deliberate to be accidental. They were not deep, but they had a pattern, as if someone had traced a shape with a fingernail. I wiped them away, thinking they might fade with the morning light, but the next day, fresh marks had appeared in the exact same spot. When I mentioned it to a friend, they laughed it off, insisting it was nothing more than my overactive imagination. But I knew what I'd seen. As the weeks passed, the incidents escalated. I started finding small, handwritten notes in places I frequented. A note taped to my fridge read simply, "I see you," in neat, almost clinical handwriting. Another note slipped under my door said, "Don't forget." I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was either a cruel prank or a figment of my stressed mind. Yet deep down, I felt there was something far more sinister behind these occurrences. It wasn't just confined to my apartment. One evening, while waiting for the bus home, I noticed a man in a dark jacket staring at me from across the street. His gaze was unnervingly fixed, and when I looked away and then back, he had disappeared. The next day, I passed by the same bus stop and saw him again, standing under the flickering streetlight, his eyes glinting in the dark. I wanted to confront him, to demand an explanation, but each time I approached, he melted into the crowd as if he were never there at all. His presence left me with an unshakable feeling of being watched, as though I were part of a scene that repeated itself with slight variations I couldn't control. Back at home, my personal sanctuary began to betray me. I noticed that objects in my apartment would inexplicably change positions. I'd leave my phone on the coffee table, only to return later and find it on the windowsill. I arranged my collection of books one night, and the next morning, they were in a different order, almost as if someone had taken the time to reorganize them meticulously. Sometimes I'd catch fleeting glimpses of a shadow in the periphery of my vision, vanishing when I turned to look directly. I became increasingly paranoid, questioning whether these changes were coincidences or if my surroundings were being manipulated. The tipping point came one night when I awoke to the sound of soft tapping. Groggily, I sat up in bed and listened as the sound grew louder, coming from the living room. I crept out of my bedroom and peered around the corner. The lamp on my desk, which I was certain had been switched off before I went to sleep, was now glowing dimly. On the wall above it, I noticed a new mark, a series of scratches that spelled out something I couldn't quite decipher. My heart pounded as I reached out to touch it, only to pull back in horror. I felt as though I had stepped into a scene that wasn't entirely my own, a place where my actions were no longer the only ones dictating reality. I began recording every detail, photographing the changes, and noting every incident in a journal. I tried to share these recordings with friends, but when they looked, everything seemed normal. They insisted that nothing was out of place, that I was just being paranoid. Their dismissive responses only deepened my isolation. I was trapped in a reality that seemed to be shifting around me, subtle at first, then increasingly overt, until I was no longer sure if I was the one driving these changes or if something else was rewriting my life. Late one night, I sat in my living room, the silence around me heavy with dread, and came to a chilling realization. The disappearance of items, the shifting of furniture, the mysterious notes and marks, it wasn't random. It was as if I had become part of an elaborate, closed-loop system, a glitch in the fabric of reality that I could neither escape nor control. Every time I thought I had found stability, the environment would change, reminding me that nothing was permanent, nothing was secure. Now, as I write this with trembling hands, I am left with a lingering sense of mystery and unease. I no longer know if these events are mere coincidences or if they point to something far more disturbing, a reality that is not as solid as it seems, a world where the boundaries between what is real and what is manipulated have dissolved. I'm haunted by the question, am I simply misremembering, or has something been altering my surroundings without my consent? I may never find an answer, and perhaps that is the true horror. Every day, I live with the dread that something unseen is watching, waiting for the next moment to rewrite my life. And in that perpetual state of uncertainty, I can't help but wonder, is my reality merely an illusion, or am I trapped in a nightmare that I can never wake from? It started with the door. I've lived in my apartment for 3 years, and I know every inch of it. The scuffed wooden floors, the faint coffee stain on the kitchen counter, the way the bedroom door sticks if you don't pull it just right. But one night, as I was coming home from work, I put my key into the lock and something felt wrong. The key slid in too smoothly, and when I turned it, the door handle was cold. Colder than it should have been, like metal left outside in the dead of winter. I hesitated, my stomach twisting, but I shook it off. Maybe I was just imagining things. When I stepped inside, everything looked normal at first. My couch was exactly where I left it, the books on my shelf neatly arranged. But as I walked further in, a strange sensation settled over me, like stepping into a room where someone had just been, their presence lingering. Then I noticed the picture frame. It was a small thing, just a photo of me and my sister from a few years back. I kept it on the side table near the couch. But as I looked at it, my chest tightened. In the picture, I was wearing a blue dress. I could have sworn it had always been red. I reached for the frame, turning it over in my hands, trying to remember. Maybe I was misremembering. Maybe my brain was playing tricks on me. But as I studied the photo, my sister's expression seemed off. The smile on her face didn't quite reach her eyes, and the longer I looked, the more unnatural it seemed. Like she was forcing it, like she didn't want to be there. I put the frame down and stepped away, shaking my head. I was exhausted. That had to be it. Over the next few days, little things kept changing. My toothbrush was suddenly green instead of white. A mug I'd used for years had a chip in it that I didn't remember. The light in the hallway flickered more than usual, casting strange, shifting shadows. And then, the people started acting different. It wasn't immediate, but I noticed it in my coworkers first. One morning, I walked into the office kitchen and greeted Lisa, the receptionist. She smiled at me, but it was off, just like my sister's picture. It stretched too wide, too long, like she was holding it in place. "Good morning," she said, her voice bright, overly enthusiastic. I paused. "Hey, Lisa." She kept staring, the smile still there, frozen. "You okay?" I asked, laughing nervously. She blinked, and then, just like that, her expression relaxed, and she turned away, pouring herself a cup of coffee as if nothing had happened. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. After that, it was like I couldn't unsee it. My boss, who had always been short-tempered, was suddenly too patient, too accommodating. My neighbor, Mr. Goldman, who never spoke more than a few words to me, stopped me in the hallway and asked about my weekend in perfect detail, except I had never told him anything about it. And when I called my mom to check in, the conversation felt scripted, like she was choosing her words too carefully, as if she wasn't really my mother, just someone pretending to be. I told myself I was being paranoid, but then I saw something I couldn't ignore. One night, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. That feeling, the sense that something was just wrong, was gnawing at me. I rolled over, decided to get up for some water, when I heard it whispering. It was faint, coming from the living room. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I live alone. Slowly, I slipped out of bed, careful to keep my footsteps silent as I crept toward the hallway. The whispering continued, growing clearer as I got closer. It was low, rhythmic, like a conversation just below the edge of comprehension. I peered around the corner. The television was off. The lights were dim, but standing in the middle of the room was me, or something that looked like me. It had my back turned, but I could see my own hair, my own pajamas. It was whispering to someone or something that wasn't there. I clapped my hand over my mouth, forcing myself not to scream. My mind scrambled for an explanation, for something that made sense, but there was nothing. No reason. No logic. Just me, standing there, speaking in a voice too low for me to understand. I stepped back, my body trembling. My foot caught on the edge of the rug, and the sound of fabric shifting was deafening in the silence. The whispering stopped. The figure, myself, tilted its head slightly, as if listening. And then, in one slow, deliberate motion, it turned to look at me. I don't remember running. I don't remember grabbing my keys or shoving my feet into my sneakers. The next thing I knew, I was outside, panting, the night air biting at my skin. I didn't stop moving until I was at a friend's apartment across town, hammering on their door like a madwoman. When I finally told them what had happened, they looked at me like I was insane. And maybe I was. But when I went back to my apartment the next day, dragging my friend with me, everything was normal. The furniture was where it had always been. The picture frame, the toothbrush, the mug, all unchanged. But I know what I saw. I haven't been back since. I broke my lease, left everything behind. I don't know if whatever was in that apartment was real, if something had replaced me, if I was losing time in ways I couldn't understand. But sometimes when I'm out in public, I catch people staring. Their expressions are blank, unreadable, like they're studying me. And then they smile, too wide, too long, like they're waiting. It started with a fork. I live alone, so I know where everything in my apartment is. My routine is simple. Wake up, go to work, come home, make dinner, watch TV, go to bed. Nothing changes. I don't lose things. I don't misplace them. That's why it stuck with me when one night I reached for a fork in my kitchen drawer and found that one was missing. It wasn't a big deal at first. Maybe I'd thrown it in the dishwasher and forgotten about it. But when I checked, it wasn't there. I scoured the sink, the trash, even the fridge in case I had absent-mindedly left it somewhere strange. Nothing. It was just gone. A few days later, I noticed my mug was missing. My favorite black one. The one I used every morning. It wasn't in the cabinet where I always kept it, and it wasn't on the drying rack. I searched the entire apartment, even under my bed, thinking maybe I had taken it into my room and forgotten. Again, nothing. Then my keys. That was when I really started to panic. I always place my keys in the bowl by the door the moment I get home. It's a habit. I don't even think about it. But one morning, I woke up and they weren't there. My heart started pounding as I tore through my apartment, checking the usual places, then the unusual ones. They weren't in my pockets, my coat, my bag. I was already running late for work, so I grabbed my spare set and rushed out, but the unease stayed with me all day. When I got home that night, I found my keys sitting in the middle of my kitchen table. I stopped in the doorway, staring at them. The air in my apartment felt thick, like the walls were pressing in. I tried to convince myself that I must have put them there and forgotten. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. Things only got worse after that. Objects would shift places when I wasn't looking. I'd leave my phone on my nightstand, only to find it in the bathroom. Shoes would move from the front door to the living room. A chair at my dining table was slightly pulled out when I was sure I had pushed it in. I started double-checking everything, taking pictures before I left for work so I could compare them when I got home. And sure enough, every night, things had changed. It was never big, never anything obvious enough that I could prove to someone else, but I knew. I knew something was wrong. One night, I woke up to the sound of something shifting in the living room. I held my breath, lying still, listening. The sound was faint, like someone was lightly dragging a fingertip across my coffee table. I reached for my phone to check the time. 3:14 Uhr nachts. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, a slow, deliberate creak. I forced myself to sit up, my pulse hammering in my ears. My apartment was dark, save for the faint orange glow from the streetlights outside. I strained my ears, waiting for another sound. Nothing. After a few minutes, I convinced myself I was imagining it. I laid back down, staring at the ceiling, willing my racing heart to slow. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off. The next morning, I found my living room window unlocked. I never opened my windows. Ever. That was the moment I stopped trying to rationalize things. I called my best friend Lisa and told her everything. She listened patiently, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. "You're probably just tired," she said. "Maybe stress is making you forget things." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But when I started setting up small traps, placing items in specific ways, balancing a coin on my doorknob, things continued to move, yet nothing was disturbed. It was like whatever was in my apartment knew what I was doing. Then came the scratches. I was brushing my teeth one night when I glanced up at the bathroom mirror and noticed something on my arm. 3 thin, red scratches ran from my wrist to my elbow. They weren't deep, but they weren't shallow either. My stomach churned as I tried to remember if I had scraped myself on something, but nothing came to mind. The next morning, there were more, this time on my back. I called Lisa again, panic creeping into my voice. "Something is happening," I said. "I don't know what, but it's real." She sighed on the other end. "Have you thought about maybe talking to someone?" "I'm not crazy, Lisa. I didn't say you were. But if you think something is going on, maybe getting some outside help could." I hung up. That night, I dreamed of my apartment, but it was wrong. The furniture was all in the wrong places, the walls were slightly too narrow, and the ceiling was too high. I walked through it in my dream, my breath shallow, my heart pounding. And then I saw something in the reflection of my TV screen. A figure, standing in the doorway of my bedroom, watching me. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. I scrambled out of bed, heart racing. My apartment was silent. Too silent. The air was heavy, charged like something was waiting. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. 3:14 nachts. That's when I saw it. The chair at my dining table, the one that was always slightly pulled out, was facing my bedroom door. I ran. I left my apartment that night and never went back. I called my landlord the next day and broke my lease over the phone. I didn't care about the deposit. I didn't care about anything except getting away. I stayed with Lisa for a few days, and eventually I found a new place across town. A newer building, bright and modern, with no history. I try to forget, try to move on. But last night, I woke up suddenly, my skin prickling with unease. I checked my phone, 3:14 nachts, and when I looked toward my bedroom door, I saw it, my chair slightly pulled out. I was sitting in my usual coffee shop one brisk morning, ordering my regular cup of black coffee, when I noticed something peculiar. Everything around me seemed normal. The gentle hum of conversation, the clatter of cups, and the rhythmic hiss of the espresso machine. But then I saw him, a man who looked exactly like my childhood friend Aaron, sitting alone at a corner table, his eyes fixed blankly on a laptop screen. I hadn't seen Aaron in years, and his presence here was entirely unexpected. As I watched, he raised his hand in a greeting that looked strangely mechanical, as if he were mimicking a gesture he'd seen on a screen. I blinked and looked away, dismissing it as a trick of my tired mind. Yet the encounter planted a seed of unease that would soon grow. Later that day, on my walk home, I passed a familiar park bench where I distinctly remembered sitting just the day before, lost in thought with a book in hand. But today the bench was empty, and the carved initials I'd always seen, E+M, had been replaced with a series of cryptic symbols, X9. My heart pounded as I traced the new inscription with trembling fingers, a chill crawling up my spine. I considered the possibility that I was misremembering, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but the image of those altered characters haunted me as I hurried back home. When I arrived at my apartment, the sense of disorientation only deepened. The layout was identical to how I'd arranged it the previous night, or so I thought. The coffee table that I had placed flush against the wall was now positioned a few inches away, and the painting above my sofa, which I had carefully hung straight, now leaned at an unsettling angle. I searched my memory for an explanation, but nothing made sense. I was certain I hadn't moved a single thing. The apartment, once a sanctuary of familiarity, now felt strangely mutable, as if it were reshuffling itself when I wasn't looking. Over the next few days, the anomalies became more frequent and disconcerting. Every time I returned to the coffee shop, subtle changes awaited me. The barista's smile, once warm and genuine, now carried a distant, almost programmed quality. The chalkboard menu displayed items I didn't recall ever seeing. A pastry with a neon glow here, an unfamiliar blend of coffee there. At times, I would catch snippets of conversation that repeated exactly word for word from one visit to the next, as though the same scene were being replayed. Each repetition left me questioning whether I was stuck in a loop, caught in a moment that reset itself over and over. Then came the inexplicable glitches that defied any rational explanation. One afternoon, while scrolling through photos on my phone, I discovered a faint, pixelated figure lurking in the background of several images, always at the same spot, as if watching me from a distance. The figure's features were blurred, like a corrupted file, yet its presence was unmistakable. I tried to show the photos to friends, but when they looked, the figure was nowhere to be found. Their dismissive smiles and casual remarks only deepened my sense of isolation. Was it my mind playing tricks on me, or was there something truly amiss with the fabric of my reality? The sensation of repetition soon took on an even more unsettling tone. I began experiencing extreme déjà vu, moments when I would step outside, only to retrace the exact same route I had taken the day before, encountering the same people, hearing the same snippets of conversation, as though time itself had been looped and then edited with slight variations. I changed my routine, taking different streets and trying new paths, but the glitches persisted. Every morning, I awoke with the nagging dread that I was reliving fragments of a day already past, with small details altered in ways that defied logic. Desperate for answers, I turned to an old friend who studied quantum theory and the nature of consciousness. He listened intently as I recounted the growing string of anomalies, his face grave. "What you're describing," he said slowly, "sounds like a glitch in the matrix, a breakdown in the continuity of our reality. I know it sounds far-fetched, but some theories suggest that our universe might be a simulation, and these irregularities could be errors in the system." His words, meant to comfort me with a scientific explanation, only served to deepen my unease. If reality were indeed nothing more than code, what did these glitches mean? And were they a harbinger of something far more sinister? That night, I sat alone in my dimly lit living room, the only sound the soft hum of my refrigerator and the occasional creak of the settling building. I reviewed the footage I had recorded on my phone, each clip showing subtle shifts, a book moving off a shelf, a shadow flickering in the corner, that I had been too distracted to notice at the time. The images were disjointed, full of brief moments where time seemed to stutter, as if reality were pausing to correct itself. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin as the implications sank in. My life was being subtly rewritten, piece by imperceptible piece, and I had no idea why. Now, as I write this, I am increasingly convinced that something is fundamentally wrong with the world around me. Every day brings a new variation, a new glitch in the matrix that shatters the illusion of stability I once took for granted. I can no longer tell if these events are simply bizarre coincidences, or if I've become entangled in a much larger, inexplicable phenomenon. The line between normalcy and unreality has blurred, and I find myself questioning the very nature of existence. Have I become part of some cosmic experiment, a glitch in a grand simulation? Or has the fabric of our reality truly begun to break down, revealing a truth that is far more terrifying than I ever imagined? I may never know the answers, but one thing is certain. The world as I know it is not as it seems, and I am left to wonder if I'll ever escape the endless loop of a reality that is perpetually glitching. I've always prided myself on the comfort of routine. Every day, without fail, I left my apartment, went to work, and returned to an unchanged, familiar environment. Until recently. It started one evening when I came home after a long day at the office. I unlocked my door and stepped into my living room. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it. My favorite book lay on the coffee table, my coffee mug sat in its usual spot, and the soft hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. I shrugged off a fleeting sense of unease and went about my night. Yet later that same night, as I passed by the table to get a glass of water, I saw the mug again in precisely the same place, untouched. I distinctly remembered having picked it up earlier, only to set it down in the very spot I now observed. The next day, on my commute to work, I noticed a blue sedan parked along the side of the street. I distinctly recalled that I had never seen that car before, but as I walked past, I caught a glimpse of its front, as if it were a mirror image of something I'd seen earlier. Later, during lunch at a small diner near my office, I overheard two coworkers mention that the same blue sedan had been parked outside for hours. I found it odd, but with the bustle of the day, I convinced myself it was merely a coincidence. As days turned into weeks, these small anomalies began to accumulate. Every evening when I returned, objects in my apartment would appear to be exactly where I'd left them. And then, without any intervention on my part, they would be in the same spot again hours later. I'd leave a pair of glasses on my desk, and by the time I walked to the kitchen, they'd inexplicably reappear on the coffee table. I even caught glimpses of my own reflection on surfaces that seemed to linger a moment too long, as if the mirror was holding onto an extra image before releasing it. At first, I dismissed these events as tricks of a tired mind, but soon, the changes grew more frequent and harder to ignore. One evening, after returning from a late meeting, I found my front door slightly ajar, even though I was sure I had locked it. I spent a sleepless night double-checking every window and bolt, only to wake up and see everything in perfect order, except for one glaring detail. My digital clock, which I always set at exactly 7 a.m. before I left, now reads 6:47, then a minute later, 7 o'clock, as if time itself had paused and rewound. I chalked it up to a glitch in the clock. Yet the incident left me with an unsettling feeling that the fabric of my day was unraveling. On my way to work, I started noticing something even stranger. I'd pass by a particular street corner and see a man in a dark jacket standing silently beneath a flickering street lamp. I'd see him there one day, then not see him for a week, only to encounter him again at the exact same spot, his face unreadable and his eyes distant. I even tried approaching him once, but as soon as I got closer, he dissolved into the crowd with a vague smile that suggested he'd been expecting me all along. His presence, combined with the other inexplicable glitches, began to blur the line between mere coincidence and something far more systematic. I began documenting everything. I kept a journal, noting the precise locations and times of every unusual event, from the repositioned mug to the recurring appearance of that mysterious man, and even the inexplicable shifts in time on my digital clock. I recorded video on my phone as well, trying to capture tangible proof of these repetitive phenomena. The footage, however, was as maddening as it was cryptic. Each clip played back with minor, disorienting variations. In one video, the same scene would repeat 3 times in a loop, each repetition differing only by a few seconds or a slight shift in the angle of a shadow. At night, alone in the darkness of my apartment, I began to feel like I was not merely an observer, but an unwilling participant in a vast, impersonal experiment. Every corner of my home, every object I thought I knew, seemed to be part of a repeating pattern, a series of glitches in a reality that was slowly being rewritten before my eyes. My memories, once reliable anchors in a predictable world, now felt as if they had been tampered with, edited in real time. I couldn't shake the persistent thought that something, or someone, was controlling these anomalies. One sleepless night, as I sat hunched over my journal by the dim light of a desk lamp, I realized with a jolt that the glitches were not random at all. They were methodical, as if my entire world had been programmed to repeat and rearrange itself. Every time I tried to deviate from my routine, the same sequence of events unfurled with eerie precision. The blue sedan would reappear, the man in the dark jacket would resurface, and the misplaced objects would find their way back to the same spots. It was as though my life was caught in a loop, an endless repetition engineered by an unseen force. The final straw came one morning when I awoke to find a note on my pillow. In neat, deliberate handwriting, it read, "Welcome back." I stared at it, heart pounding, as I tried to recall if I had ever seen it before. But I knew with chilling certainty that I hadn't written it, nor had anyone else in my life. It was as if reality itself was sending me a message that I had become part of a glitch in the matrix, a small cog in a system that I could neither understand nor escape. Now, as I write this, I'm left with the inescapable realization that the world I once knew, the seamless, predictable reality that I relied on, might have been nothing more than an elaborate illusion. Everything around me, every mundane detail, is subject to change at the whim of an unfathomable code. I find myself trapped in this loop, with no clear exit, no way to tell if the familiar is truly real or merely another glitch waiting to be corrected. In the end, I'm not sure if it matters at all because reality, whatever it is, has slipped beyond my grasp, and I'm left questioning whether I'll ever be able to return to a normal world, or if I've become an eternal part of this malfunctioning, programmed simulation. I used to think that reality was as fixed as the pages of a book, until I began noticing the subtle edits in the margins. It started on an ordinary Tuesday. I woke up, made my coffee, and set out for work, as I did every day. Yet, on my way to the subway station, I passed a man on the corner I distinctly remembered from the day before. He was wearing a gray jacket and reading a newspaper with headlines that I swore had already been printed. I paused, half expecting him to vanish, but he merely looked up and nodded before continuing on his way. I brushed it off as a momentary lapse in memory, a trick of the early morning haze. That same day, at the coffee shop near my office, I ordered my usual latte. As I waited in line, I overheard the barista remark, "You're here again," in a tone that was both friendly and strangely odd. I smiled awkwardly, replying, "Yes, I am," though I hadn't seen her the day before. The familiar hum of conversation around me felt oddly rehearsed, as if every sound was a repeated loop. When I left the shop, I noticed that a book I had left on a table was now in a different spot, and the abstract painting on the wall had been swapped with another one I'd never seen before. Over the following days, these glitches became more pronounced. I would step into my apartment after work, only to find that the living room layout was subtly altered. A vase placed where my keys usually sat, a cushion rearranged on the sofa. At first, I thought I was simply misremembering, but then I began to see the same faces in different contexts. The mail carrier, for instance, would sometimes be greeted by a neighbor I knew well, even though they had never exchanged more than a polite nod before. The next time, I saw them laughing together in the hallway as if they were lifelong friends, their conversation a perfect echo of one another. The sense of repetition grew unbearable. I started keeping a journal, noting every odd occurrence. A street lamp that flickered in an irregular pattern, a passerby whose reflection in a shop window appeared twice, once as they walked by, and again in the frame of a different angle minutes later. I began to notice details that should have been constant, but weren't. My own route to work began to vary inexplicably. One morning, I turned a corner only to find the same storefront in a slightly different position, its neon sign altered just enough that I couldn't be sure it was the same shop I'd passed before. I tried discussing it with friends and coworkers, but they dismissed my concerns. "Maybe you're just tired," one said, while another suggested that I was overanalyzing normal urban quirks. They assured me that nothing was wrong, that the world wasn't glitching like some cheap computer program. Yet every day, the changes grew bolder. I would catch snippets of conversations that repeated word for word from previous days, as if someone had reloaded the script of my life. At work, a colleague once greeted me with, "Good morning again," as if it were a cue from a looped recording. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was the only one aware of the inconsistency, that I was trapped in a reality that was being subtly rewritten around me. One evening, as I sat alone in my dimly lit apartment reviewing my notes, I heard a soft, almost imperceptible hum coming from the hallway. It was as if the walls themselves were murmuring, reciting lines of dialogue that I'd heard before. I walked to the door and opened it a crack, peering out into the corridor. The light from the overhead bulbs flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw my own reflection staring back at me in the glass panel of a closed door, even though I knew I hadn't looked in that direction before. I felt a chill as the realization crept in. The pattern wasn't random. It was as if the world around me was malfunctioning, looping through variations of itself. I began to suspect that I wasn't just witnessing glitches, but that I was somehow caught in them. Every time I tried to change my routine, the same sequence of events unfolded, only with small, disconcerting differences. I attempted to escape the cycle by taking an entirely new route to a meeting, yet I arrived at the same place, greeted by the same puzzled faces that echoed my previous encounters. It was as though the fabric of reality was being reassembled around me, piece by piece, with no regard for continuity. Late one night, after a particularly unsettling day, I sat by my window watching the city's lights flicker like faulty pixels. I realized with mounting dread that these glitches were not random anomalies, but a systematic unraveling of the world I once trusted. Every object that shifted, every repeated face, every echo of conversation felt like a deliberate alteration, a subtle manipulation that I could neither understand nor stop. I came to the terrifying conclusion that perhaps I had become part of something much larger, a fractured simulation where the normal rules of cause and effect no longer applied, and every moment was subject to unexpected revision. Now, as I write this, I find myself staring at the same scene outside my window, a view that shifts ever so slightly with each passing second. The lines between what is real and what is altered have blurred to the point where I can no longer tell the difference. I have no idea if I will ever return to a world where things remain consistent, where memories and reality align. It seems I have become entangled in this endless glitch, a loop from which there may be no escape, and every day I wonder if I am still in control or if I have become merely another variable in a cosmic experiment gone awry. I moved into a new apartment about a year ago. It was small, quiet, and affordable, everything I needed. I had just started a new job, and the last thing I wanted was to add any more stress to my life, so the apartment was perfect. It was on the second floor of a slightly rundown building, but the rent was reasonable, and it was close to work. The landlord, an older man named Mr. Miller, seemed friendly enough, though a little aloof. He handed me the keys with a simple, "Don't worry about the quirks. It's an old building, but it's solid." At first, everything was completely normal. I unpacked my things, arranged the furniture, and began settling into the routine of my new life. The first few days felt like a fresh start, new apartment, new job, new life. But then the little things started happening. It started with the kitchen table. I left it in the corner of the room by the window, facing the wall, with just 2 chairs. I was fairly certain I hadn't moved anything since I set it up. But one morning, when I woke up and walked into the kitchen to grab my coffee, I saw that the table had been moved. It was now in the center of the room, with all 4 chairs neatly arranged around it. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe I had just forgotten. Maybe I was sleep-deprived from the stress of settling into a new job. So, I moved the table back to its original position and carried on with my day. But the next morning, it was back in the middle of the room again. I was confused, but I figured maybe I was losing my mind. The next few days were filled with the same routine. I would leave for work, come home, and find something slightly different. Books I had left in one spot were on the shelf in a different order. A drawer that had been closed was now open by a few inches, and the bathroom towel would be folded differently. It felt like nothing major was happening, but over time, it was starting to get under my skin. I started paying closer attention to the apartment. I left a note on the kitchen counter one evening, simply reading, "Don't move the table." The next day, I returned from work to find the note gone. The table moved again, and an unfamiliar piece of paper left in its place. It said, "We've been waiting for you." That was when things took a darker turn. I started taking pictures of the apartment when I left for work, hoping to catch whatever was going on. The first day I tried it, nothing changed. But the second day, I came back to find the couch cushion I had been sitting on earlier in the day completely fluffed up. I had just sat there. I remembered clearly that I hadn't touched anything. The most unsettling part, however, was that my phone camera had somehow captured the cushion in a different position from what I had seen before I left. It was just a slight shift, but it was there. I didn't sleep well that night. I began to feel like I was losing control of my surroundings. My mind started spiraling, wondering if I was hallucinating or if someone had a key to my apartment and was messing with me. I asked Mr. Miller about it, but he shrugged it off. Old buildings can do that, he said, not offering any further explanation. He wasn't a very helpful landlord, but at least he hadn't raised any suspicion. Then one afternoon, I walked into my apartment and immediately noticed something different. The painting above my bed, the one I had hung up myself, was slightly askew. It wasn't just a little crooked. It was hanging in a completely different position than I had left it. I froze in place. I checked the other rooms. The bathroom mirror was fogged up, and when I wiped it clean, I saw something written on the glass. It said, "It's not real." I rushed to the kitchen, and sure enough, the table had been moved again. But this time, there was something different. A key was sitting in the middle of the table, with no explanation for where it had come from. I didn't recognize it, and it didn't seem to fit any of the locks in the apartment. I stood there for a few moments, wondering if I was losing my mind. The following night, after an exhausting day at work, I decided to leave the apartment to clear my head. I went for a walk, trying to calm myself. When I returned hours later, the door was unlocked. I froze. I had locked it. I always locked it. I checked everything, lights, windows, and doors, and they all seemed normal. But the feeling of unease didn't go away. The apartment was still the same, yet it wasn't. That night, I stayed up late, trying to piece everything together. I examined the photos I'd taken and compared them to the reality in front of me. Each time, I saw slight differences. The coffee cup I left on the counter was a different brand than the one I had used. My socks were arranged in a way I hadn't left them. The worst part was that nothing in my own mind could explain the changes. They were so subtle, so small, that they couldn't just be a mistake. And then one night, I found something even more chilling. I woke up in the middle of the night, suddenly alert. The room felt different, like the walls were too close, like the air was heavier than usual. I got up, looked around, and immediately noticed that my entire apartment had shifted again. The furniture wasn't where it was supposed to be. My bed had moved across the room. The chair I had been sitting in had shifted next to it, and a bookshelf had appeared where the couch once was. I ran out into the hallway, breathless, but the hallway was the same. The stairs, the walls, the doors, they were all as I remembered. But the apartment, the very space I was supposed to call home, was different. That was when I truly felt it, that creeping sense that I wasn't just imagining it. My apartment had somehow become a different place, and I wasn't sure why, or how, or even what was happening. I had one final conversation with Mr. Miller before I left. I told him everything, how the apartment kept changing, how nothing felt right. He just stared at me, his face expressionless, and said, "It's just an old building, kid. Happens to a lot of people." I left that night. I'm living somewhere else now, but the feeling hasn't gone away. Every time I look at a new space or walk into a new room, I feel like I'm being watched, like the walls are slowly closing in. I feel as if I'm trapped somewhere between reality and something else, something that's always shifting, always changing. And every so often, I'll notice small things in my new place. A photo that's slightly different, a sound I didn't make, a strange sensation that I can't quite place. Maybe it's me. Maybe it's my mind playing tricks. But I can't shake the feeling that I'm not in control anymore, that I never was. I always believed I was the master of my own fate, that I controlled my every thought, every action. But about 6 months ago, that certainty began to unravel. It started subtly. I'd lose track of time in the middle of conversations, like entire minutes were simply snatched away without my knowledge. I'd be talking with friends, only to realize later that I couldn't recall half the details of what I'd said. At first, I blamed exhaustion or stress, thinking I was simply overworked. But soon more disturbing things started to happen. One afternoon at work, I was in a meeting when I suddenly felt as though my body was on autopilot. I had been nodding along, but then, out of nowhere, I found myself laughing at a joke I didn't remember hearing. When the meeting ended, I asked a colleague if I'd been unusually animated, but he just gave me a puzzled look, as if my behavior had been completely normal. That night, while reviewing emails on my laptop, I noticed that a message I was certain I had typed was completely missing. I had no idea when or how it had vanished. The real terror began when I started noticing changes in my own actions. I would walk down the street and catch myself taking a wrong turn, only to later see that I had navigated the route perfectly, as if I were retracing steps I couldn't recall making. My daily routines, once as reliable as clockwork, began to fracture. There were mornings when I'd wake up with a strange sense of déjà vu, realizing that entire chunks of time, hours sometimes, had slipped away from me without explanation. I'd look at my watch and see a time that didn't match my recollections of when I'd gone to bed. But it wasn't just my lost time or forgotten conversations. I began to notice that my very personality was shifting. Friends commented that I seemed different, less engaged, more distant, and sometimes even my own reflection in the mirror felt like a stranger. I'd catch glimpses of myself acting out of character. A harsh word here, a laugh that sounded hollow there, as if my emotions were being dictated by someone else. I tried to piece together the fragments of my memory, but every attempt left me with a gnawing sense that something was rewriting the narrative of my life. One evening, after returning home from an unusually long day, I sat in the dark of my living room and stared at the blank ceiling. I began scribbling in a notebook, desperate to capture every detail of the day. But as I reread my notes, I found that parts of them were inconsistent, phrases that contradicted each other, timelines that didn't add up. It was as if the act of remembering was itself being manipulated, edited out of my control. I started to wonder if my memories were no longer my own, if something or someone was tampering with the record of my life. In a final, chilling incident, I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of soft, deliberate footsteps in my hallway. I lay frozen, heart pounding, as I listened to the rhythmic patter coming closer. Then, as suddenly as it began, the sound stopped. I mustered the courage to peek out, only to find the corridor empty and silent, bathed in the cold light of a street lamp. But I could still feel it, an invisible presence, as if someone were watching me from within my own home, guiding my every move, altering my actions without me even realizing. When I tried to tell my friends, my coworkers, even my family, they dismissed it all as stress, as hallucinations born of fatigue. Maybe you're just losing sleep, they said, or you're overthinking things. But every day, the changes grew more pronounced. I began to fear that I was trapped in a web of my own mind, that I was losing the ability to determine my own will. Each lapse, each forgotten moment, left me with an inescapable sense that something far more sinister was at work, a force within me, controlling my thoughts, my actions, my very identity. Now, as I sit here writing this, I feel a cold dread that I can't shake. I no longer know if I am truly the one making my choices or if I am merely a puppet, my strings pulled by some unseen hand. My reality feels fractured, unreliable, as if it has been tampered with from the inside out. I have no proof, only the gut-wrenching certainty that every day, a piece of me is being erased, rewritten, and lost. I may never find answers to these inexplicable phenomena, but one horrifying thought remains. I am not in complete control, and that loss of control is the most terrifying truth of all. It started with the smallest things, details that, at first, I convinced myself were merely quirks of my own absent-mindedness. I moved into my apartment 2 years ago, a modest place in a familiar neighborhood that I had always considered home. Everything was just as I'd left it when I first stepped in. The worn but comfortable couch, the well-arranged collection of books on the shelf, even the picture of my family on the wall. But one evening, after a long day at work, I noticed something that made me pause. I left my favorite mug on the side table, the one with the chipped rim that I always use for my late-night tea. When I went to retrieve it later that night, it was still there, exactly as I had left it, Nothing unusual, until the next morning when I found it in the exact same spot, untouched, yet I distinctly remembered having used it moments earlier. I brushed off the feeling, blaming it on fatigue. Over the following weeks, the anomalies began to multiply. One day, I came home to find that the arrangement of my living room had inexplicably changed. The armchair I had positioned by the window was now pushed against the opposite wall, and a small table I was sure I'd never owned sat near the doorway. At first, I thought I might have forgotten moving something in my exhaustion, but no, I had a clear memory of the original setup. I mentioned it to a neighbor over the fence, Mrs. Jacobs, who'd lived down the block for decades. But she merely smiled and said, "You must be more tired than usual, dear." Then came the changes in people. My co-workers, once friendly and predictable, began acting oddly. Tom from accounting, who always joked about our mundane office life, started repeating phrases that sounded like rehearsed lines from a play. He would greet me in the morning with a warm, "Hello, friend," even though I knew he typically said something much more curt. And when I tried to recall conversations from the previous day, his responses would be blank, as if the discussion had never occurred. At first, I chalked it up to stress and the long hours we'd been putting in, but the dissonance grew too persistent to ignore. I began to document everything, scribbling notes in a journal and taking photographs of my apartment, hoping to catch a change that I might later point to. I compared picture after picture of my living room, convinced that some items had shifted ever so slightly. The clock on my wall, for example, always read the same time when I left, yet when I returned, it sometimes appeared a few minutes ahead or behind. At times, I even caught a glimpse of a reflection in the window, a shadow that wasn't mine, lingering just long enough to unsettle me. I tried showing these oddities to friends, but whenever I mentioned them, they assured me that everything looked perfectly normal. "Are you sure you remember it that way?" they'd ask, with a puzzled look that only deepened my isolation. One evening, as I sat in my apartment trying to make sense of it all, I found a note taped to the back of my door. In neat, unassuming handwriting, it read, "Nothing stays the same." I felt a chill ripple through me as I stared at the message, the words echoing in my mind. I confronted my landlord, Mr. Delgado, a kindly man who had rented me the apartment, but he simply shook his head and said, "Old buildings have their quirks, son. You're imagining things." His dismissive tone offered no comfort. Instead, it fed the growing suspicion that I was caught in something far more unsettling than a series of coincidences. As the days passed, the changes escalated into a pattern that was impossible to ignore. I would set my alarm clock at the usual time, only to wake up and find it off by several minutes. The familiar route from my front door to the bus stop would subtly shift. A tree would be slightly closer to the sidewalk, or a shop's awning would be a bit different in color. One night, I returned from work, exhausted and disoriented, only to realize that the hallway outside my apartment had new markings on the walls, scratches that formed patterns I couldn't decipher. When I asked a friend who lived in the same building if they'd noticed anything unusual, they laughed and said, "This place always looks the same to me." I grew increasingly anxious, feeling that my reality was being rewritten while I remained the only one aware of the changes. I started to question my own sanity. Was I hallucinating? Was it all in my head? Yet every time I checked, every photograph I took confirmed that something was off. My apartment, the people I knew, even the streets outside, seemed to be part of an endless loop of subtle alterations. I began to feel trapped in a world that was simultaneously familiar and alien, as if I were living in a simulation that was being gradually reprogrammed around me. One night, unable to sleep and desperate for answers, I sat in the darkened living room, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the silence. I stared at the photo of my family, the edges of the frame slightly misaligned from the wall. A realization began to creep in, a horrifying thought that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't alone in noticing these changes. Perhaps something was manipulating the fabric of my reality, editing the details of my life without my consent. The idea was too monstrous to fully comprehend, yet it was growing stronger with every unexplained occurrence. Now, as I write this, I feel a deep-seated dread that I can't shake. I no longer trust my senses. Every creak in the hallway, every misplaced object, every slight alteration in a familiar face makes me question the world around me. My friends and neighbors, who insist that nothing has changed, seem distant and unreachable, like they're trapped in a different version of reality where the rules remain constant. But I know what I see, and it haunts me. I'm left with a lingering, unsettling question. Am I the only one who is truly awake, or have I been cast aside in a world that's slowly shifting into something unrecognizable? I fear that I'm trapped in a loop, forced to bear witness to a reality that's being reshaped by forces beyond my understanding. And until I find a way to break free, or until I stop noticing these changes, I remain alone, adrift in a universe that feels increasingly alien and hostile, where nothing is as it once was and every day brings a new, inexplicable twist in the fabric of my life. I moved into my new apartment in early autumn, thinking a change of scenery would help me forget the past few stressful years. The building was old but charming, tucked away on a quiet street where neighbors waved politely as they passed. The unit was modest, a one-bedroom with creaky hardwood floors, a small kitchen, and a living room that overlooked a narrow alley. For the first few weeks, everything felt exactly as I had hoped: predictable, comfortable, and entirely ordinary. I set up my furniture meticulously, placed a few framed photographs on the wall, and even arranged my books by color on the shelf. Life was routine and unremarkable. Then, one night, as I was unwinding with a cup of tea, I reached for the favorite mug I always used. I distinctly remembered placing it on the side table earlier in the evening, but now it was gone. I searched the kitchen, behind the counter, on the dining table, even near the window's sill. Yet there was no trace of it. I assumed I must have misplaced it in my exhaustion and put it down somewhere else, so I let it go. But the next morning, when I made my coffee, I saw it there, exactly where it had been the night before. Confused, I chalked it up to a lapse in memory. Over the following days, small anomalies began to accumulate. One afternoon, I returned home from work and found the living room rearranged. The armchair that had always sat by the window was now pushed against the opposite wall, and a small side table that I had never owned was tucked near the sofa. I distinctly remembered leaving everything exactly as I had arranged it. When I mentioned it to a neighbor over the fence, Mrs. Collins, a kindly old woman who had lived in the building for decades, she merely smiled and said, "Oh, this place does that sometimes. You must be imagining things, dear." Her dismissal only deepened my unease. Then came the strange behavior of people I thought I knew. At work, my usual morning greetings fell off. Michael from accounting, who always gave me a curt nod, suddenly said, "Good morning, my friend," in a tone that felt too rehearsed. Later, during a routine lunch break, I overheard a conversation between two colleagues in which they discussed a weekend outing I never mentioned, yet described it in such intimate detail that it seemed as if I had planned it all along. I asked one of them if we'd ever talked about it before, but they looked at me blankly, as if I were speaking in riddles. One evening, after a long day that left me more anxious than usual, I found a handwritten note on my front door. It read, "Everything changes." I wasn't sure whether to be comforted or frightened. I tried to show it to friends, but they shrugged it off, saying it must have been left by a neighbor with a sense of humor. But I knew something was off. Things escalated slowly. I began to notice that objects in my apartment were moving on their own. I would leave my keys on the hall table, and when I returned from work, they'd be in the kitchen. I would position a cushion on the sofa exactly as I liked it, only to find it slightly off, almost as if someone had adjusted it. At night, I sometimes caught a glimpse of a shadow moving across the hallway, only to vanish when I looked directly. I installed a small camera in the living room, hoping to capture some rational explanation. The footage, however, only deepened the mystery. There were brief moments when the room seemed to shimmer, as if reality itself had momentarily stuttered. My anxiety grew into paranoia. I started keeping a detailed journal, noting every discrepancy. The time on my clock being a few minutes off, the rearranged furniture, the odd comments from coworkers. I even began to suspect that my own actions were no longer entirely my own. I would sometimes find myself in parts of the apartment that I didn't recall visiting, or remember conversations that seemed to have been edited by someone else. At times, it felt as though I were living in a loop, a series of moments that repeated with subtle differences each time. I was sure that my reality was shifting around me. Yet every time I tried to explain it to someone, they insisted nothing was amiss. One particularly stormy night, as rain hammered against the windows and the wind howled through the corridors, I sat in the darkened living room, heart pounding, trying to piece together what was happening. I recalled the note on my door and the feeling that I was being watched, not by an intruder from outside, but by something or someone that had been woven into the fabric of my everyday life. In that moment, a terrible thought struck me. Perhaps the changes weren't random coincidences, but part of a larger, unexplainable design. My memories, my routines, even the people I interacted with, all seemed to be shifting as if orchestrated by an unseen hand. I confronted Mr. Reynolds, the building's manager, and described the changes in my apartment, the inexplicable rearrangements, and the strange behavior of those around me. He listened with a furrowed brow, then calmly said, "I assure you, everything is as it should be. You're under a lot of stress. Maybe you're imagining things." His voice was gentle, but his dismissal chilled me to the core. Now, as I write this, I'm left with an enduring sense of dread. I no longer know if my perception of reality is reliable or if I've become trapped in a closed loop, a world that appears normal to everyone else, but is profoundly alien and hostile to me. Every creak in the hallway, every altered object, every fleeting moment of recognition twisted into something unrecognizable reminds me that the world I once trusted is slipping away. I've learned that some truths are too unsettling to confront, yet I can't escape the feeling that I'm being subtly manipulated by forces beyond my control. Whether it's a trick of my mind or something far more sinister, one thing is clear. I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone in experiencing these changes, and that my reality might be nothing more than an elaborate illusion, designed to trap me in a nightmare I can never wake from. I first noticed him the day I moved into my new apartment on Elmwood Lane, a quiet, unassuming street where everyone greeted one another with a nod and a smile. His name was Darren, and he was my neighbor from across the hall. At first, Darren's presence seemed entirely benign. He greeted me with a warm smile when I lugged in my boxes, and over the next few days, we exchanged polite hellos in the elevator and in the building's narrow, dimly lit corridors. I assumed he was simply the kind of friendly person one might hope to meet in a tight-knit community. However, as the weeks wore on, little things began to disturb the comfortable routine I had come to rely on. Darren's questions started to stray far beyond small talk. Instead of just asking about the weather or commenting on the state of the building, he began probing into my personal life, my work schedule, my weekend plans, and even the names of my closest friends. At first, I brushed off these inquiries as overzealous curiosity, but his tone was too measured, too deliberate, and there was something in his gaze that unsettled me. It was as if he was not merely making conversation, but quietly gathering details about my life. Then came the compliments, at first innocuous, a comment here or there about my taste in decor or the way I arrange my living room furniture. Yet soon, these compliments morphed into unsettling observations. One afternoon, while I was tending to the small balcony garden, he leaned casually against the doorframe and said, "You really know how to make a place feel like home. It's rare to see someone so meticulous." The emphasis on my meticulousness left me with an inexplicable chill, as though he were scrutinizing not just my taste, but my entire existence. I tried to rationalize his words, chalking it up to a quirky habit or an odd manner of speaking. But deep down, my gut told me something wasn't right. Over time, Darren's presence became nearly inescapable. I would catch glimpses of him in a hallway when I wasn't expecting anyone, or see him outside the building as I returned from work. It wasn't enough for him to simply say hello anymore. He would ask where I was going, remark on how unexpected it was to see me at certain times, and even offer unsolicited advice about how to improve my security at home. His recommendations were oddly specific. He mentioned checking the locks, adjusting the blinds to prevent prying eyes, and even questioned whether I had updated my phone security settings. It all felt too invasive, too calculated. One night, after a particularly long day at work, I returned to my apartment to find my door slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered locking it before I left. Yet there it was, the latch unlatched as if someone had fiddled with it. My heart raced as I cautiously stepped inside, scanning the dim room for any sign of intrusion. There was no evidence of a break-in. Nothing appeared to be out of place, but a lingering sense of violation settled over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that Darren had been near, as if his unblinking eyes had been watching my every move. Then came the incident that shattered the fragile veneer of normality. One cold, overcast evening, I was on my way home when I noticed Darren waiting outside the building. Unlike before, he was standing silently, almost too still, his eyes fixed on me with a look that was neither friendly nor curious, just unnervingly intense. As I approached, he stepped forward and said softly, "I was hoping to catch you before you left. It's important to know what's happening around us." His words were cryptic, and his tone carried a hint of something more, something that felt like a warning. I mumbled an excuse about having an early meeting the next morning and hurried past him, my footsteps echoing in the deserted street. In the days that followed, I became increasingly paranoid. Every time I left my apartment, I double-checked the locks, and every time I saw Darren in the hallway or outside, my pulse quickened. I began to record my encounters on my phone, noting down the time, his exact words, and even the peculiar inflection in his voice that grew more sinister with each conversation. I noticed that whenever I mentioned these incidents to friends or even other neighbors, they either brushed them off as nothing more than a misinterpretation of a well-meaning individual's behavior or, even stranger, seemed to have no recollection of any such occurrences. My intuition screamed that something was amiss, something far beyond a neighborly quirk. The subtle signs of control and aggression, the relentless questioning, and the invasive advice were not random acts of kindness, but rather calculated moves designed to undermine my sense of safety. One night, as I sat by my window trying to calm my frayed nerves, I saw Darren's silhouette pass by the glass, lingering in the shadows before disappearing around the corner. I couldn't tell if it was his habitual presence or something more deliberate, as if he was ensuring that I never forgot his omnipresence. Now, as I write this in the quiet isolation of my apartment, I can't help but wonder if I've simply overestimated a harmless neighbor's eccentricities or if I'm facing something far more insidious. My sleep is restless, haunted by the memory of his calculated compliments and the piercing intensity of his gaze. Every time I step outside, I feel his eyes on me, and I'm left questioning if my own instincts are leading me astray. I've learned to trust my gut, yet there remains an unsettling doubt. What if the danger isn't as obvious as a broken lock or an aggressive confrontation? What if it's the gradual erosion of your privacy, the creeping realization that someone is slowly taking control of your life? I share my story not to incite panic, but as a warning to anyone who may find themselves in a similar situation. There are people out there who wear the mask of harmlessness while quietly chipping away at the fabric of your reality, making you question every interaction and every friendly smile. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that Darren's quiet persistence might escalate into something far more dangerous, or that perhaps I'm merely caught in a web of my own anxious thoughts. One thing is clear. Sometimes, the most unassuming strangers are the ones who leave the deepest, most unsettling marks on your life, and you never really know when or where you might encounter them again. It started with little things: a creak in the hallway at midnight, a misplaced mug on the kitchen counter, a soft melody that seemed to float through my apartment on a quiet afternoon. I moved into my small, second-hand apartment in a building that had seen better days, and for the first few weeks, I chalked these moments up to an overworked mind and the quirks of an old building settling into its own rhythm. I told myself that fatigue and stress were playing tricks on me, but soon the coincidences began to accumulate. At first, it was benign enough. I'd come home after a long day to find the couch slightly shifted from where I remembered leaving it. The next morning, I'd catch a glimpse of what I thought was a shadow out of the corner of my eye, a figure that vanished when I turned to look directly. I even met a man on my evening walk who bore an uncanny resemblance to a friend from my childhood, though I had never mentioned him to anyone. I laughed it off, attributing it to a trick of the light or my mind jumbling old memories with the present. Yet, the anomalies grew too consistent to ignore. One evening, while I was tidying up, I noticed that a small, framed photograph of a landscape, a picture I'd left on the windowsill, had inexplicably moved to the living room mantel. When I asked my neighbor about it, she only offered a sympathetic smile and mentioned that sometimes objects in the building seemed to wander on their own. I dismissed it as an eccentricity, a quirk of a community steeped in old superstitions. Then came the sounds, faint whispers in the dead of night that sounded almost like a lullaby, the kind my mother used to sing when I was a child. They were so soft I could barely discern words, yet the tone was hauntingly familiar. I set up a recorder, hoping to capture something tangible, a voice, a pattern, but all I managed was static punctuated by an occasional, indistinct murmur. The more I listened, the more I questioned if I was truly hearing something, or if my mind was conjuring these sounds to fill the silence. My journal soon became a frantic chronicle of disappearing objects and the occasional, inexplicable appearance of items I swore I had never owned. A book would vanish from my shelf, only to reappear later with a different cover. My keys, always on the hook by the door, would sometimes be found in the freezer. The rational part of my mind struggled to keep up with the mounting evidence of something or someone tinkering with the boundaries of reality around me. The strangest occurrence happened one rainy evening. I returned home soaked and tired, only to find a man sitting on my doorstep. His face was familiar, though I couldn't place where I'd seen him before. He offered no greeting, just a sad, knowing look that sent shivers down my spine. When I blinked, he was gone. I spent hours searching the neighborhood and even asked around, but no one had ever seen him. In the days that followed, I began to notice him in fleeting reflections. A flash in the window, a figure in a dark doorway. Always watching, always just out of focus. His presence was both comforting and deeply unsettling, as if he were a guardian of secrets I wasn't meant to understand. With every passing day, the line between what was real and what might be a product of my fraying sanity blurred further. I started to question every sensation, every memory. I would find myself standing in the middle of a room, staring at an object that had no place in its usual spot, convinced that it must be a mistake of my own perception. The voices and images became so frequent that I wondered if I was losing touch with reality, or if there truly was a hidden current of inexplicable events swirling just beneath the surface of everyday life. I reached out to friends and even posted online, seeking validation or at least an explanation. The responses were a mix of concern and skepticism. Some suggested I see a therapist. Others hinted at more paranormal explanations, as if my experiences were an invitation to explore realms beyond reason. I found no solace, only mounting evidence in my own eyes that something was fundamentally wrong, or perhaps something was simply too right. Tonight, as I sit alone in the dim glow of my desk lamp, I hear that faint humming again, a lullaby that seems to echo through the empty corridors of my mind. I can't tell if it's a trick of the acoustics or a deliberate message meant for me. Every object, every sound, every fleeting glimpse of that mysterious man now carries a weight I cannot ignore. Am I simply a victim of an overtaxed imagination? Or is there a deeper, unexplainable force at play here? I record these words in hopes that someday someone will understand or at least acknowledge the truth of what I've experienced. As I lay here in the stillness, the distinction between reality and delusion feels as fragile as a thin sheet of ice. The unanswered questions loom large. Are these events merely the product of a mind in distress, or have I unwittingly become entangled in a mystery that defies conventional explanation? I have no answers, only a lingering sense of dread and the possibility that everything I have experienced might be real, or nothing more than the haunted echoes of my own imagination. It started with a small, unsettling inconvenience, a set of keys missing from their usual hook by the door. I'd been meticulous about keeping my apartment in order, so when I reached for them one morning and found only an empty space, I assumed I'd simply misplaced them during last night's rush. A quick search under cushions and behind the door yielded nothing, but I managed to borrow a spare from a friend, shrugging off the incident as a minor lapse. Over the following days, however, other oddities began to appear, each one as innocuous as the last, until they started to accumulate in ways that left me doubting my own sanity. At first, it was just a mug moved from the kitchen counter to the dining table, or a notebook left open to a page I didn't recall reading. I chalked these up to tiredness and absent-mindedness. But then I noticed something stranger: conversations with people who seemed to forget having had them. When I mentioned a shared lunch with a coworker, she paused as if trying to recall the event, then politely dismissed it as an afterthought. Even my neighbor, Mrs. Holloway, always so vivid in her recollections of town gossip, would often look at me quizzically when I referred to something we'd discussed just moments before, as if I had invented it on the spot. I tried to maintain a rational perspective. I began keeping a journal to note every odd occurrence: the time the hallway light flickered for no apparent reason, the persistent hum of the refrigerator that seemed to grow louder on certain nights, and the inexplicable rearrangement of items in my living room. In the margins, I scrawled theories: faulty wiring, a trick of the light, or even my own forgetfulness. Yet the events only escalated. One evening, I discovered a small scrap of paper tucked beneath my door, bearing a single phrase in shaky handwriting: "You're not alone." I assumed it was a cruel prank, perhaps the work of a bored teenager, but the words gnawed at me. Soon more disturbing changes began to occur. On my daily walks through the neighborhood, I started to notice that people's faces would seem to blur or shift when I looked away, only to reappear unchanged the next time I looked directly at them. I even encountered a man I was certain I'd met before, a friend from high school whose features I recognized in fleeting moments. But when I tried to recall our past conversations, he acted as though we were strangers. It was as if my recollections were at odds with everyone else's memory, leaving me stranded in a reality where I was the only one who remembered things correctly. I became obsessed with gathering proof that these strange occurrences were not figments of an overtaxed mind. I set up my phone to record conversations and installed a small camera in my living room. But the footage was as enigmatic as the events themselves. In one clip, I swore I saw a shadow, distinct and human, flip behind me as I sat reading. In another, my own voice, distorted and layered with an echo, murmured phrases I couldn't remember speaking aloud. Every time I reviewed the recordings, my heart would pound with the dread that I was witnessing something inexplicable, a reality in which the rules I'd always known were slowly unraveling. The strangest part was the way people began to change. Friends and acquaintances, who once recalled shared memories with ease, now treated me as if I were an outsider. A dinner invitation from a longtime friend turned into a stilted encounter where she acted as though our past closeness was a vague notion, not something tangible. Even strangers on the street gave me fleeting glances filled with uncertainty, as if they too sensed that something was off. It wasn't long before I started feeling like I was watching my own life from a distance, unable to anchor myself in any moment that felt truly mine. Late one night, I sat at my desk, my journal spread out before me, when I heard a soft knock at my apartment door. I wasn't expecting anyone. Hesitantly, I opened the door to find an envelope lying on the welcome mat. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the same trembling handwriting scrawled across it: "You're not alone." The identical phrase from before. My pulse raced as I tried to comprehend the meaning behind it. Had someone been watching me? Was this all a setup, a well-crafted illusion meant to drive me mad? I couldn't tell if it was a cruel trick of fate, a hallucination born from mounting stress, or something far more sinister. Now, as I write these words in the dim glow of my desk lamp, I feel an oppressive weight pressing on my mind. The mundane events of everyday life have transformed into a tapestry of subtle, yet increasingly bizarre occurrences. Every misplaced item, every forgotten conversation, every fleeting glimpse of an unfamiliar face adds to a growing sense of unreality. Am I simply a victim of my own fractured memory? Or is there an external force, an unseen hand, rewriting the script of my life? I don't have answers, only the disquieting feeling that I am no longer in control of my own story. I lie awake in bed, listening to the hum of the night, wondering if tomorrow will bring another anomaly or if I will finally be forced to confront a truth too terrible to face. The line between reality and delusion has blurred beyond recognition, leaving me suspended in a state of perpetual uncertainty. Every sound, every shadow, every whispered word seems loaded with meaning that I can neither decipher nor dismiss. And so, as the night deepens and the mysteries multiply, I am left to question, is this the work of my overactive imagination, or is something, or someone else steering the course of my life? The truth remains elusive, and with each passing day, I fear that the answers, if they ever come, may shatter whatever semblance of normalcy I once knew. It started on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon when I sat in my favorite corner at the little cafe on Maple Street. I was absorbed in a book and the soft murmur of conversations when I noticed him for the first time. A man in a worn gray jacket with an expression that seemed simultaneously neutral and oddly intent. At first, I assumed he was just another patron lost in his own thoughts. He sat a few tables away, his eyes occasionally flickering in my direction, but nothing about his presence warranted more than a passing glance. I returned to my book, dismissing the nagging sensation that I was being watched as nothing more than a trick of an overactive imagination. Over the next several days, I began encountering the same stranger in places I would never have expected. While waiting at the bus stop near my apartment, I caught a glimpse of him leaning against a lamppost, his gaze fixed on something or someone beyond the crowd. At the grocery store, I noticed him perusing the produce section, his eyes scanning the aisles with an almost calculated precision before he moved on without a word. I even saw him in the park during an early morning jog, where he paused to watch me stretch on a bench. Each time, I try to rationalize his appearances as mere coincidences, perhaps because Maple Street was small and our routines might naturally intersect. Yet, a creeping unease began to take hold of me. It wasn't long before his presence started to feel invasive. One evening, as I walked home along a quiet residential street, I heard the soft rustle of footsteps behind me. Glancing over my shoulder, I saw him at a distance, moving with a measured, almost purposeful gait. I quickened my pace, my heart hammering against my chest, and when I dared look back again, he had vanished into the night. The incident left me shaken, and I found myself looking over my shoulder, even in broad daylight. I began to notice small, inexplicable signs that he might be deliberately marking his presence. An abandoned newspaper with his handwriting scrawled on it, a receipt left on a park bench with his initials on the corner, even a phrase hastily written on a fogged-up window, "I see you." At first, these signs were ambiguous enough to be dismissed as random acts or the products of my stressed mind. But soon, the subtle cues evolved into overt gestures. During one late afternoon at the bus stop, as I scrolled through my phone, I saw him approach and strike up a conversation. His smile was warm, his tone disarmingly casual as he asked if I'd seen the latest art exhibit downtown, or if I happened to know a good place to grab a bite after work. The conversation was unnervingly precise, like he'd done his homework on me. And while his words were polite, they carried an undercurrent of insistence that made my skin crawl. I excused myself, muttering a vague, "I'm busy," and hurried off, my pulse racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that every encounter was choreographed, a deliberate attempt to draw me into his orbit. Each subsequent meeting left me increasingly agitated and isolated. I started keeping a meticulous log of every time and place I saw him, convinced that his repeated appearances were more than coincidences. At first, my friends and family brushed it off as paranoia. After all, I'd always been a bit anxious. But as the days turned into weeks, the pattern was undeniable. There he was at my usual coffee shop, at the library, even outside the building where I worked. His presence wasn't accompanied by any overt threats or hostility. Rather, it was his quiet persistence and the unnerving way he seemed to know so much about my routine that began to haunt me. The emotional toll was profound. I felt like I was losing control of my own life, as if I had become an unwitting participant in someone else's meticulously planned script. The more I tried to break free, the more I felt ensnared in his orbit. My sleep became restless, punctuated by dreams where his eyes watched me from the shadows. I began to question my own judgment. Was I overreacting to a harmless coincidence, or was I really being singled out by someone whose intentions were anything but benign? The lingering suspicion that he was not merely a random encounter, but rather part of some larger, obsessive plan, left me in a state of perpetual dread. Despite my mounting anxiety, I never managed to confront him directly, nor did I gather any solid evidence that would confirm my worst fears. His interactions remained ambiguous, polite, even charming at times, yet always underscored by an inexplicable intensity. I noticed that whenever I mentioned my concerns to others, they either offered a reassuring smile or an apologetic shake of the head, as if my experience was an isolated aberration of an overactive mind. But late at night, when the world was quiet and my thoughts turned inward, the image of that gray jacket and those piercing eyes would reappear, a constant reminder of my vulnerability. Now, as I sit alone in my dimly lit apartment, I find myself glancing at every shadow and listening for every footstep. The feeling of being watched is inescapable, and the question haunts me. Is this all just a series of unfortunate coincidences, or am I truly the target of someone's obsessive plan? I've learned to live with the uncertainty, but the sense of helplessness lingers, leaving me to wonder if, at any moment, this stranger, so casually interwoven into the fabric of my daily life, might step out of the background and change everything. Ever since I moved to the quiet town of Maplewood, something about the nights felt off. I had grown up on city lights and constant bustle, but here, even the darkness seemed to breathe a secret life of its own. I first noticed it one chilly October evening as I returned from a late shift at the diner. The moon hung low and pale in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the empty streets. I was driving along a narrow road when my attention was caught by a flickering light near an abandoned house on the outskirts of town. The building, hidden by overgrown ivy and twisted oaks, looked as if it had been forsaken for decades. Yet there was an inexplicable pull that urged me to stop and investigate. Parking a few blocks away, I walked towards the house, my footsteps echoing in the silent night. The closer I got, the more I felt as if unseen eyes were watching my every move. A cold shiver ran down my spine when I noticed that the door, though partially ajar, revealed a warm, inviting glow from inside. My rational mind screamed to turn back, but something compelled me to step inside. The air within was stale and heavy, filled with a musty scent of decay, but intermingled with an odor I couldn't quite place. Something metallic, almost like blood. I began exploring the first floor, each creak of the wooden floorboards magnified in the oppressive silence. In what appeared to be a living room, there were remnants of a life once lived. Faded photographs in ornate frames, a broken clock frozen at 3:17, and a diary with pages scattered across the floor. I picked up the diary, its pages brittle with age, and read fragments of a story that hinted at dark rituals and whispered incantations. The entries grew increasingly frantic, describing visits from shadowy figures and voices that seemed to emanate from the very walls. With each word, I felt an intensifying dread, as though I were unraveling secrets that should have remained buried. As I continued my exploration, the atmosphere shifted unnervingly. The lights seemed to dim further, and a low hum, almost imperceptible, began to resonate through the hallways. I noticed a peculiar pattern. The hum was synchronized with the rhythm of my own heartbeat. I tried to leave, but the door through which I had entered was now inexplicably locked, its ancient hinges groaning in protest when I tugged at it. Panic set in. I found myself trapped in a labyrinth of decaying corridors, where every turn led to more unsettling discoveries. A room filled with mirrors that reflected not my image but fleeting silhouettes. A staircase that descended into pitch darkness, despite no basement being mentioned in any records, and walls inscribed with symbols I couldn't decipher. At the climax of my terror, I entered a room that seemed untouched by time. In its center was a circular pedestal, upon which rested a single, dusty photograph of a family that bore an uncanny resemblance to the portraits in the diary. The eyes of the figures in the photograph appeared to follow me, their gazes heavy with sorrow and accusation. Suddenly, the humming crescendoed into a cacophony of whispers. I could swear I heard my name being chanted, over and over, as if the house itself were alive and intent on claiming me. In that moment, I realized I wasn't a mere intruder. I was a part of something far older and darker. Desperate and trembling, I tried every door, every window, but the oppressive force held me captive. The house seemed to warp reality, stretching corridors and bending time. I witnessed fleeting images of a past filled with torment, visions of spectral figures performing rituals, and shadows dancing in the periphery of my vision. Each vision was as vivid as if I were reliving a long-forgotten nightmare. Hours, or perhaps minutes, passed in a haze of terror until I found a narrow escape through a concealed passage behind a tattered curtain. I burst out into the cold night air, gasping as if freed from a suffocating grip, only to find that the world outside seemed altered, silent, and void of any comforting normalcy. To this day, I can't explain what I experienced in that forsaken house. The diary's final entry ended abruptly, as if the writer had been silenced, and no one in town recalls the existence of such a place. Sometimes, late at night, I hear that same faint hum echoing through my apartment, and I catch fleeting glimpses of those accusatory eyes and reflective surfaces. I have tried to piece together the fragments of that night, but the memory remains disjointed, an unfinished puzzle that haunts me relentlessly. I fear that the house, or whatever dwelled within, is still out there, waiting, watching, and perhaps one day coming for me again. In the lingering quiet of my thoughts, the line between reality and nightmare blurs, leaving me to wonder if the horrors of that night were a mere hallucination or an encounter with something inexplicably supernatural. Each midnight, as shadows creep and silence deepens, the dread returns, a reminder that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, forever echoing in the dark corridors of our minds. The silence persists. The questions remain unanswered. I lie awake, listening to the wind as it whispers secrets of that fateful night. I have scoured every memory, every detail, searching for clues to break the cycle of dread. Yet, each time I close my eyes, I am transported back to that cursed house, where time stands still and the past refuses to die. The boundary between the known and the unknown has dissolved, leaving me adrift in a sea of perpetual unease. And so, with every tick of the clock and every creak of the floorboards, I am reminded that some doors, once opened, can never be closed, and some mysteries are destined to haunt us for all eternity. Even now, as I recount these events, a chill runs down my spine, for the memories are as vivid as if they occurred mere moments ago. I often find myself staring into the dark, questioning if the boundaries of my reality have been permanently altered by that dreadful encounter. In the dead of night, when the world is silent and the stars seem to hide behind a veil of mystery, I hear the soft murmur of voices and the echo of footsteps that are not my own. The terror of that night lingers like a shadow, an ever-present reminder that some secrets are better left undisturbed. I dare not dismiss the possibility that what I experienced was not a figment of my imagination, but a glimpse into a realm where time, death, and the supernatural converge in ways beyond human comprehension. My sleep is restless, haunted by dreams of that forsaken house and the sinister whispers that beckon from its depths. I continue my days with a cautious eye on the darkness, forever wary of the unseen forces that may one day return. There is no solace in knowing, only the constant, gnawing anxiety that the boundary between our world and the unknown is perilously thin, and that at any moment it might shatter, allowing the horrors of that night to seep back into my life. I remain vigilant, though burdened by a fear that grows with each passing night, as I realize that some encounters leave scars not visible to the eye, but etched deep within the soul. It started with my keys, I've always been the kind of person who puts things in the same place every day: my keys, my wallet, my phone. They always go on the little wooden tray by my front door. It's a habit, muscle memory. But one morning, as I was rushing to leave for work, my keys weren't there. I checked my pockets, my bag, retraced my steps from the night before. Nothing. After nearly half an hour of tearing my apartment apart, I found them sitting on my kitchen counter. It was strange because I hadn't been in the kitchen the night before, but I shook it off as absent-mindedness. Maybe I was more tired than I realized. A week later, it happened again. This time, it was my phone. I left it charging on my nightstand before bed, but in the morning, it was sitting face down on the living room coffee table. My apartment is small, and I live alone. There's no one else who could have moved it. I checked my door, my windows, everything was locked. Again, I reasoned that I must have forgotten moving it. Then the notes started appearing. At first, I thought I was leaving them for myself and just forgetting. The first one was a small yellow sticky note on my bathroom mirror. "Don't forget," written in my own handwriting, though I had no memory of writing it. It was unsettling, but not alarming. Maybe I had scribbled it down in a rush and simply forgotten. But then another appeared. This one on the fridge, scrawled in black ink on a torn piece of paper. "Check the door." I checked. It was locked. A few nights later, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a faint clicking sound. Half asleep, I thought it was just the heater settling, but as I lay in bed, I realized it was coming from the direction of my front door. I got up, heart pounding, and peeked through the peephole. Nothing. I turned on all the lights, checked every room, even opened the door and looked down the hallway. Everything was still, too still. I started feeling like I was losing my mind. Things continued disappearing and reappearing. My TV remote would be in the freezer. My toothbrush would be in the drawer where I kept my silverware. Small but deliberate changes that made me feel like my own home was turning against me. Every time I mentioned it to friends, they either laughed or told me I was overworked, stressed. But I wasn't. I knew something was happening. One night, I decided to set up my phone to record overnight. I placed it on my nightstand, camera facing my bedroom door, and hit record before going to sleep. When I woke up, I felt that same creeping sense of wrongness. My blankets were pulled slightly off the bed. My closet door, which I always left shut, was open just a crack. Dreading what I might see, I grabbed my phone and checked the video. The footage was normal at first, just me shifting in my sleep, nothing unusual. But then, around 2:47 a.m., the bedroom door moved. Not much, just a slight push inward, as if someone had gently nudged it. But it was enough. I rewound the footage, stomach tightening. I watched closely, trying to convince myself it was a draft, a shift in air pressure. But then in the next frame, I saw something that made my skin go cold. A hand, just barely visible in the dark, reaching around the edge of the door. I dropped my phone. My breath hitched, heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I replayed it again, hoping, praying I had imagined it. But it was there, pale, barely visible in the dim light, fingers curling around the door frame before retreating. I locked myself in my bathroom for what felt like hours, my brain cycling through every possible explanation. No forced entry, no open windows, no sign that anyone had ever been in my apartment except me. And yet, something had been there, watching. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. I started noticing other things, small scratches on the inside of my front door, as if something had been clawing at it. A faint, rhythmic tapping noise that would start late at night and then stop the moment I moved. I tried to tell myself it was just paranoia, stress. But then the final note appeared, and I knew it wasn't in my head. It was left on my pillow. "You let me in." I left that night and never went back. I broke my lease, packed what I could fit into my car, and drove until my eyes burned from exhaustion. I still don't know how they got in. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know this: whoever or whatever it was, they were waiting, and I had been living with them for longer than I realized. I moved into the small, aging apartment on Maple Street with nothing more than a few boxes and a hopeful heart. The building, constructed nearly a century ago, had a charm that modern complexes lacked, but it also carried an unsettling air that I dismissed as merely the quirks of old architecture. My first night was uneventful. I unpacked slowly in the dim light of a single lamp and listened to the distant hum of the city. Yet, as days turned into weeks, small anomalies began to disturb the calm of my new home. At first, it was trivial enough. A door left ajar that I was sure I had closed, a picture frame tilted slightly out of alignment. I attributed these occurrences to my own forgetfulness or the building settling into its ancient bones. Determined to remain rational, I started keeping a log of every oddity, noting the time, the conditions, and my own reactions. I even set up a basic video camera in the living room, convinced that a logical explanation would eventually emerge. One evening, while reviewing the footage from a quiet midnight hour, I saw something that defied explanation. In the far corner of the frame, a shadow moved slowly along the wall, though no one was present in the room. The figure was vague, a mere distortion of darkness, but its movement was deliberate, as if it were searching. I replayed the clip repeatedly, analyzing every pixel, but found nothing that could rationalize its presence. I shared the video with a few friends, hoping they would offer a technical perspective, yet they too were baffled, their responses ranging from skepticism to quiet unease. As the weeks passed, the disturbances escalated. I began hearing soft, almost imperceptible whispers in the dead of night, voices that spoke in tones that both comforted and unsettled me. Their words were muffled, as if coming from a great distance, and I could never discern a clear message. I set up additional recorders in various rooms, determined to capture any sound that might provide clues. The recordings, however, revealed only intermittent static punctuated by what sounded like faint murmurs. Then came the night that shattered my insistence on logic. Late after midnight, I awoke to a persistent knocking at my door, a slow, measured rap that sent chills down my spine. When I opened the door, there was no one there, only the empty corridor bathed in the cold glow of a flickering street lamp. Moments later, I noticed strange, fresh scratches along the wooden frame of the door, as though someone or something had tried to claw its way in. My heart pounded as I photographed the marks and examined them under better light, searching for natural explanations. The scratches were too deliberate, too angular, and they disappeared without a trace the next morning. I reached out to the landlord, an elderly man with a dismissive smile, who insisted that the building was known for its little quirks and urged me not to worry. Desperation began to erode my rationality. I combed through online forums, shared my video and audio clips, and even consulted with an electrician about the unusual power surges that coincided with the disturbances. Each expert I encountered had a plausible explanation for some of the anomalies, yet none could account for the persistent whispers or the inexplicable shadow. In one particularly harrowing recording, I caught what sounded like a name, a single chilling syllable repeated over and over, as if calling me from beyond. I scrutinized the audio, attempting to filter out background noise, but the name remained indistinct, evoking a sense of foreboding I could not shake. My nights became a series of anxious vigils, waiting for the next inexplicable event, each one more unnerving than the last. On a cold, overcast evening, I decided to investigate the building's narrow, cluttered basement, a place long avoided by tenants. Descending the creaking stairs with only a flashlight for company, I discovered markings on the damp walls that mirrored the cryptic symbols I had seen elsewhere in the building. The symbols were arranged in a pattern that suggested ritualistic significance, and they exuded an aura of menace that made my skin crawl. I documented everything, my hands trembling as I recorded every detail, and tried to maintain a veneer of logic by noting environmental conditions and historical references provided by a local archivist. Yet, each piece of evidence only deepened the mystery. Now, as I sit here in the oppressive silence of my apartment, the anomalies persist with a quiet determination. The recordings, the photographs, the inexplicable power fluctuations, all point to something that defies conventional understanding. I am left with a disquieting question. If there is a logical explanation, why do these events continue to escalate? Is it possible that the building itself harbors a secret, a presence that manipulates reality in subtle, terrifying ways? Despite all my efforts to find evidence and reason, I remain haunted by the persistent feeling that I have uncovered only the surface of something far more sinister. Every shadow, every whisper, every unexplained phenomenon now carries with it a warning. And as I close this entry, I am left to wonder if I am truly alone, or if I have inadvertently become entangled in a mystery that is both immeasurable and inexplicable. In the quiet hours before dawn, I sit with my journal in hand, reflecting on the cascade of events that have upended my once normal life. Every sound, every flicker of light, now seems laden with hidden meaning. I pore over the collected evidence, searching for patterns that might reveal a rational cause. Yet the deeper I delve, the more I am drawn into uncertainty. The unanswered questions multiply like shadows in the dark corners of my mind, leaving me to wonder if some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. I am left with a lingering dread and a persistent hope that, somehow, clarity will come. But until then, I must live with the unsettling truth that not every phenomenon conforms to the simple laws of logic, and that sometimes reality is far stranger and far more terrifying than any fiction I could ever imagine. Every day since these events began, I have grappled with the tension between rationality and the inexplicable. I meticulously review each piece of evidence, cross-referencing timestamps and ambient conditions, yet nothing offers a complete explanation. Even the neighbors, who casually mention odd creaks and unexplained cold spots, provide no reassurance. My attempts to contact local experts have resulted in polite dismissal or cryptic warnings to stop delving too deeply. The more I search for a logical pattern, the more elusive it becomes, as if the disturbances are designed to defy analysis. With each unanswered question, I feel increasingly isolated, trapped between a world governed by reason and an undercurrent of dark mystery that refuses to fade. I fear that the truth may lie beyond the scope of human understanding, and that my continued pursuit might awaken something best left undisturbed. When I moved into my new apartment, everything seemed perfectly normal. It was a small one-bedroom in an older building, but it was clean, quiet, and most importantly, affordable. I had spent the first day unpacking, setting up furniture, and getting everything just how I liked it. The place felt empty but comfortable, like it was waiting to become home. That first night, I slept soundly, exhausted from the move. But when I woke up the next morning, something was different. The chair. I had placed a single wooden chair near the window, facing outside. But now, it was facing inward toward the rest of the room. I frowned, trying to remember if I had moved it before bed. Maybe I had, in some half-asleep days, without thinking. I turned it back toward the window and brushed it off as nothing. But the next morning, it had moved again. This time, it was even stranger. The chair was now pulled out slightly, like someone had just stood up from sitting in it. My stomach tightened. I lived alone. I checked the door, the windows. Everything was locked. There was no way anyone could have come in. For the next few days, the chair kept moving. Sometimes it was facing the window, sometimes the door, and once I found it completely across the room. I tried setting up my phone to record overnight, but every time, the footage would show nothing unusual. The chair just moved between frames, as if it had always been in its new position. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. Then other things began to change. One night, I came home from work and noticed something was different about my bookshelf. A book I was sure I had placed on the middle shelf was now on the top. Another book was upside down. Again, small things barely noticeable, but I knew I hadn't touched them. Soon it wasn't just objects. The layout of my apartment started shifting. One evening, I went into the kitchen to grab a glass of water, only to freeze in my tracks. The fridge was on the opposite side of the room. I stood there, staring, feeling my pulse thudding in my ears. I'd lived there for weeks. I knew where my fridge was. I knew I wasn't wrong. But there it was, standing like it had always been in that new spot. I checked my phone for photos of my apartment. I was sure I had taken some when I first moved in, but they were different. In every picture, the fridge was in its new position, as if it had always been there. As if my memory was wrong, but I knew it wasn't. Things escalated from there. My bathroom mirror, once a small rectangular shape, became round overnight. The rug in my living room changed color. One morning, I woke up to find my bedroom door on the wrong wall. The worst part? No one believed me. I called my mom, told her something was wrong with the apartment. She said moving was stressful and that I was probably just imagining things. My coworkers laughed when I brought it up, assuming it was a weird dream or a joke. Even my best friend, who had visited once before, insisted the layout had always been this way. I started marking things. I put tape on the floor to outline furniture placement. I wrote notes to myself about where things were, what was different. But every morning, the notes would be gone, replaced with new ones in handwriting that looked like mine, but wasn't. Notes that said things like, "Everything is fine. You're remembering wrong. Don't fight it." I barely slept. I barely ate. I was terrified that if I left, I would come back to a place I didn't recognize anymore. One night I heard something, a soft scraping noise, like furniture being moved, but slower, more deliberate. I held my breath and crept into the living room. The chair was moving, not by itself, not in some ghostly, floating manner. It was being dragged by something I couldn't see. I ran. I grabbed my keys, my phone, and I ran out of that apartment and into the street, gasping for air. I spent the night in my car, heart pounding, mind racing. The next morning, I returned. Everything was different. The walls were a different color. The furniture was rearranged. My bedroom was where my kitchen had been. My bed was gone. And the worst part? There was no door. I spun in circles, panic clawing at my chest. The door I had just walked through minutes ago wasn't there. There were windows, but they looked out onto nothing. Just an endless gray fog. I tried calling for help. My phone had no signal. The messages on my notepad had changed again. "You shouldn't have left. This is home now. Stop looking for a way out. I don't know how long I've been here." Sometimes I wake up and everything shifts again. The walls move. The ceiling stretches. The furniture disappears and reappears in new places. I scream, but no one hears me. I try to sleep, but when I wake up, the apartment is different again. I think whatever is in here with me doesn't want me to leave. Or worse, I think it's trying to make me forget I ever wanted to.